Chapter 71. Han Shu and Phoebe had prepared for the entire day and took advantage of the evening to board a carriage from the north of the city to the south of the city where the Buzzed Merchant Guild was. Han Shu and Phoebe sat shoulder to shoulder within the carriage. In front of the two of them were two simple crossbows with intricate carvings and a dagger that gleamed with a cold light. "This crossbow and dagger are much better than the ones you took from the Orc-Wolf riders last time. I'm giving them all to you for free." Phoebe held a clean silk ribbon in her hand and carefully wiped the long sword in her hand as she spoke coldly to Han Shu. The crossbow and dagger were held in Han Shu's hands and he couldn't bear to part with them. Han Shu was quite satisfied with Phoebe's generosity and said with a light smile, "Don't count on me too much for this time's assassination. My strength isn't as strong as you think. I'll mainly help you keep watch and act as your assistant. You'll still have to do most of the work. Got it? Just listen to my instructions later and I'll tell you what to do." Phoebe rolled her eyes at Han Shu and said a bit angrily. Taking out a small bottle from his space ring, Han Shu carefully poured some powder onto his fingertips and very cautiously smeared it on the tips of the dagger and crossbow bolts. He then hurriedly wiped his fingertips that had just been coated with the powder clean. Phoebe was a bit curious about Han Shu's actions and moved slightly closer to Han Shu. She stared at Han Shu's actions and observed him for a while before opening her mouth to ask in confusion, "What are you doing?" A wisp of orchid-like fragrance drifted into Han Shu's nose and mouth as Phoebe drew closer. Han Shu couldn't help but glance at Phoebe as his heart fluttered for no reason. Phoebe was wearing the same tight-fitting black night clothes as Han Shu today. The tight night clothes revealed Phoebe's beautiful figure without a doubt. She had a finely sculpted face and a stunning beauty blossomed from her bright eyes, causing Han Shu's heart to run wild as he looked at her. "I already have Fanny. Although this Phoebe is beautiful, her personality is too cold, and there are too many troublesome and dangerous things on her," Han Shu silently said to himself, and then turned his head away, continuing to focus on cleaning his dagger and crossbow bolts. He replied faintly, "Nothing much, just rubbed some poison powder on." "Despicable, shameless, this is against the laws of the Empire. If someone were to find out, you'd be in big trouble," Phoebe said coldly with a face full of disdain. "It doesn't matter. What we're doing today isn't honorable anyway, so no one will know about it. Heh, you're my accomplice, so I don't think you'd slap yourself in the face." Han Shu laughed lowly and said with a bit of pride. When Han Shu said this, Phoebe couldn't help but feel angry. However, she had a favor to ask, so she only snorted coldly and didn't say anything. After Han Shu had applied poison powder to the crossbow bolts and dagger, Han Shu thought for a moment, and pulled out a few sharp steel needles from his thigh. He was very patient, applying poison powder to these needles as well. Phoebe snorted lightly again when she saw this, seeming to despise Han Shu's actions greatly. When everything was done, Han Shu put away all his weapons and finally looked at Phoebe, saying, "Oh right, why didn't you directly make a move against Grover, and instead went to kill two lackeys who wouldn't be of much use? Grover holds some key items of the guild in his hands. He's placed these items in the hands of one of his trusted mistresses. If Grover dies, his mistress will certainly publicize these items. This will be a devastating blow to our guild, so before I kill Grover, I must first find his mistress and grasp these items in my hands." Phoebe flicked a glance at Han Shu and explained a bit unwillingly. The larger the guild, the more shady transactions there were. For example, when Han Shu had plundered the Orc-Wolf riders' resources last time, those items should have originally belonged to the shops in the town of Droll. The Empire had long since made it clear that citizens had to hand over these resources if they obtained them. Fabian and Han Shu's transactions were already considered a violation of the Empire's laws. If the Empire knew of the Buzzed Merchant Guild's actions, the guild would be hard-pressed to escape punishment. For a guild like the Buzzed Merchant Guild, there were certainly many more similar illegal transactions. It looked like these important items were in Grover's hands. No wonder Phoebe didn't dare make a move against Grover lightly. The two of them discussed some details in low voices when the carriage suddenly came to a stop. The coachman said softly from the front, Miss, we've arrived at the back door of the guild. Let's go! Phoebe looked at Han Shu and dismounted first. Han Shu stuck his head out and looked left and right before dismounting as well. Miss, come in quickly and be careful. Grover has just left the Buzz Merchant Guild with a few experts. We don't know where they've gone, but they'll usually return at night. An old man from the Buzz Merchant Guild was waiting at the back door. When he saw Phoebe and Han Shu appear, he hurriedly moved aside to let the two in. Thank you for your hard work, Phoebe said to the old man and glanced at Han Shu, walking quickly into the Buzz Merchant Guild. Han Shu followed closely behind Phoebe, also moving quickly. Most of the people in the guild are Grover's people. I can only mobilize a few old men, and this is all because Grover doesn't know of my relationship with them. There are many guards inside, so we must be careful. Otherwise, if we're discovered, not only will the assassination fail, but it may even be difficult for us to leave alive. Phoebe was extremely familiar with the Buzz Merchant Guild. When she brought Han Shu along quickly, they avoided quite a few guards and didn't forget to remind Han Shu repeatedly. The sky was now completely dark. There was no moon tonight, and the thick black clouds in the sky blocked out all light. Some of the lights in the corridors of the Buzz Merchant Guild couldn't shine too far. Phoebe lived up to her strength as a sword master all right. Her nimble body surprised Han Shu greatly. Her body was silent as she darted about, and her speed was very fast. After Han Shu had calmed down, his extraordinary facial features surprised Han Shu. The dark of the night couldn't obstruct Han Shu's vision at all. Even without the illumination of the lights, Han Shu could clearly see the fish swimming in the pond under the fake mountain in the distance. The footsteps coming from far away and the low murmurs in some rooms were all clearly audible to Han Shu. Han Shu's calm movements were also incomparably nimble, like a cheetah searching for prey. He didn't make a single sound as he silently followed behind Phoebe. Suddenly, Han Shu quickly closed in and grabbed Phoebe. He brought Phoebe's body and suddenly squeezed into a crack in a nearby fake mountain. The crack in the fake mountain was very narrow, and when the two squeezed in, their chests pressed tightly against each other. Han Shu could feel the ample bosom of Phoebe. Phoebe's pretty face was enraged as she glared fiercely at Han Shu, her eyes looking like they were about to spit fire. Shoo! Han Shu raised his index finger and made a shushing gesture. His eyes darted around, indicating that something was wrong with Phoebe. The anger on Phoebe's face hadn't disappeared even after Han Shu's actions. A trace of bashful red spread across Phoebe's slender, fair neck. Now that the two's thighs were pressed against each other, and their chests were pressed against each other, they could even feel each other's heartbeat. An ambiguous atmosphere instantly spread and rippled. As if she didn't dare look at Han Shu again, Phoebe pressed her cheek against Han Shu's ear and said in an extremely low voice, "If there's nothing wrong, I'll kill you." Han Shu's face turned bitter, but he calmed himself and didn't say anything. When he felt extremely light footsteps approaching, he couldn't help but slow his breathing. He even shook his head slightly, wanting to warn Phoebe. Who knew that because Phoebe's jade lips were moving closer to Han Shu's shake of his head actually caused Phoebe's fragrant lips to directly press against Han Shu's cheek. Just as Phoebe's breathing was unsteady and she was a bit angry from embarrassment, Han Shu had already turned his head with difficulty and used a resolute gaze to signal Phoebe to be careful. Phoebe had the cultivation of a sword master after all, and her mental fortitude wasn't weak. At this critical moment, she only took a deep breath and her rapid heartbeat immediately calmed down. However, because she took a deep breath, her ample breasts involuntarily puffed up, causing Han Shu to almost moan uncontrollably. My wind barrier clearly sensed movement, and I rushed here as fast as I could. Why didn't I discover anything? Is it because I've been too careful lately? A man's voice muttered to himself in a low voice not far from the two of them. After this voice appeared, extremely light footsteps slowly rang out in the surroundings. If it wasn't for the fact that Phoebe's attention was at its highest and that this person was extremely close to them, it would have been very difficult for her to hear these footsteps. Since he was a wind mage, if he used wind magic, he could indeed greatly reduce the weight of his body. His walking speed would be faster than that of an ordinary mage or warrior, and his footsteps would be lighter and more silent. It was no wonder that even with Phoebe's strength as a sword master, she could only detect movement when he got close. As Han Shu and Phoebe were on tenterhooks, this person patrolled the surroundings once before quietly leaving. However, this time, Phoebe didn't dare to act rashly. She was afraid that her judgment would be wrong. She glared fiercely at Han Shu, as if trying to find clues from Han Shu's face. After a while, Han Shu exhaled lightly and said in a low voice, "He's gone!" Phoebe used both her hands and feet to forcefully squeeze out from the cracks in the fake mountain after he'd spoken. She lowered her head and said softly, "I'll let it go this time. Next time something like this happens, find me a wider place, or I won't let you go." Phoebe circled around the area after she'd spoken and hurried in another direction. When she saw that Han Shu wasn't following her with a wry smile, she couldn't help but put her hands on her hips and scolded softly. "You don't want the black gold or any more?" "Coming!" Han Shu responded and followed a bit helplessly, thinking to himself, "Where am I going to find a wide hiding place for you at a critical moment?" They didn't run into any more unexpected incidents after that. Phoebe led Han Shu around the path and avoided a few waves of guards before finally entering Darnell and Yuna's room. "Let's make some preparations and wait for these B*****s to return," Phoebe immediately said through gritted teeth as soon as they entered the room, as if she wanted to vent all of her anger from just now on Darnell and Yuna. And so, Han Shu and Phoebe began to get busy, preparing to assassinate Grover's 2 loyal lackeys who were about to return. Chapter 72. The door creaked open, and the 2 slowly walked in, slowly making their way to the edge of the bed where Han Shu was hiding. At this moment, a setup that had been set up beforehand had produced a miraculous effect. Han Shu had already tampered with a few of the legs of the round table that had been placed in front of the door. Because the 2 were incredibly anxious, they didn't make a detour around the round table, but rather flew towards it, planning on using it as a foothold to quickly leave the room. It was at this moment that light footsteps gradually approached from an extremely far distance. Han Shu's brow furrowed as he carefully discerned and said to Phoebe, "They should be back, I can hear them." When Han Shu raised the crossbow in his hand and aimed it at Darnell, he discovered that both of them were completely naked. Yuna's snow-white left thigh already had a crossbow bolt stuck in it. She grit her teeth in pain as she walked, and her body wasn't nimble enough. Darnell was even more wretched. His lower body was a bloody mess of flesh and blood, and he had an expression of inconsolable grief on his face as he howled in agony like a wolf. A shrill cry that was 10 times more painful than Yuna's suddenly emitted from Darnell's mouth like a pig being slaughtered. The 2's minds that had just reached the peak of pleasure completely cleared up, and they suddenly dashed out of the room from the bed as they yelled, the agonized cries from their mouths never stopping. At this moment, Han Shu's ears had already heard light footsteps in the distance. He rushed towards the 2 again after a moment of panic. Phoebe had already destroyed the water dragon at the same time, and was also chasing after the 2 with a speed that wasn't inferior to Han Shu's. The 2 had just steadied themselves when they saw that they were completely enveloped by Phoebe's sword. Darnell suddenly pulled Yuna and pushed her into Phoebe's sword under Yuna's horrified gaze. He himself didn't even turn his head to look at Yuna as he recklessly dashed out of the room. "Oh, it looks like your master must be a very powerful assassin," Han Shu said lightly. Han Shu didn't respond and followed Phoebe's previous instructions. He crouched down and rolled to the side, landing under the bed. Seeing that Han Shu was ready, Phoebe's beautiful eyes scanned the surroundings and suddenly leapt up, using the chandelier to hide in the shadows of the roof. After a while, just as Han Shu could clearly feel Phoebe's breathing increase and was afraid that she wouldn't be able to hide her tracks, the actions of the adulterous couple above grew more and more violent. The loud panting and moans grew louder and louder, and the movements of the bed continued to increase. It was obvious that they had reached a critical moment. Suddenly, something unexpected happened. The 2 of them landed on the round table, and with a creaking sound, a few of the table's legs suddenly broke. "Let's go!" Yuna yelled loudly at this moment. If it was according to Han Shuo's original personality, he naturally wouldn't have been so cautious and steady when dealing with the matter. However, because of his training in magical yuan, Han Shuo had basically been constantly enduring inhuman pain. This had unknowingly formed Han Shuo's tenacious and indomitable personality. No, do you think I'm you? From the moment I entered the guild until now, I've always been working under your command. I think you wouldn't have been able to grasp these methods without some special experience. It looks like you've been an assassin before, otherwise how could you be so skilled? Han Shuo lifted his head to sweep a glance at Phoebe after he'd finally cleaned off the wooden splinters on the bed. A series of rustling sounds of clothes being taken off, mixed with Darnell's lewd laughter and Yuna's light panting, gradually filled the room. An exceedingly light panting fell into Han Shuo's ears. Han Shuo suddenly started and then immediately sensed that the panting should have come from Phoebe on the roof. He didn't know if she was angry or also affected. Han Shuo, who was under the bed, heard the sounds above him and felt the sway of the bed. He didn't need to think to know that the adulterous couple had already begun fighting. The hot-blooded Han Shuo couldn't help but start imagining the scene above in his mind. He desperately wanted to climb out to take a clear look, and his body had long since become uncontrollably aroused with strong masculine characteristics. The sounds of kissing followed, as Darnell's lewd laughter and Yuna's panting grew louder and louder. The wooden bed above Han Shuo's head turned from calm to a small boat amidst giant waves, rocking and rocking continuously. A moan that sounded like a sob suddenly traveled out from Yuna's mouth, followed by a series of banging sounds and panting moans, mixed with Yuna's uncontrollable moans. A crossbow bolt flew out like lightning, shooting straight for Darnell's back. Darnell, who was howling in pain and shock, was actually still able to sense the danger behind him at this moment. The long sword he'd long since drawn flared with a deep green light as he suddenly turned around and swung, shattering the crossbow bolt that Han Shuo had shot at him. The dagger in Han Shuo's hand had locked onto a small hole in the wooden bed that he'd long since pierced through before Yuna had even finished saying, "Stab." He stabbed viciously upwards. However, the timely appearance of the water barrier bought the two a few seconds of time. The two screamed as they ran out of the room. However, the chandelier hanging from the ceiling suddenly came crashing down halfway through the room, forcing Darnell to stop again and raise his long sword to sweep the chandelier to the side. Han Shuo fired another bolt from the crossbow in his hand and then carelessly tossed it to the side. Han Shuo's dagger was already upon him when Darnell had shattered the crossbow bolt. Due to the pain of losing his manhood, Darnell's face had turned to madness amidst his grief. His fighting aura was raised to the maximum as he swung his sword to meet Han Shuo's dagger. Han Shuo and Phoebe understood that if they didn't kill the two of them now, they wouldn't have another chance once they left the room. Therefore, they used all their strength to keep the two of them in the room. Darnell glared viciously at Han Shuo, but didn't give chase. He covered his lower body with his left hand and continued to rush out of the room. Heh, her skin is as smooth as silk, and her face looks like it's been painstakingly drawn by an artist. It's said that she hasn't even tried a man yet. It would be a pity for such a beauty to not enjoy my strength before she dies, Darnell said with a lewd smile. However, the poison powder that Han Shuo had smeared on his dagger finally took effect at this moment. Darnell's footsteps suddenly became as heavy as 1,000 pounds after he'd taken 2 steps forward. Han Shuo quickly closed in before he could react and swung his dagger again, taking Darnell's life. A water dragon had appeared out of nowhere and was attacking fiercely around Phoebe. However, a section of the water dragon's body was cut off with each stab of Phoebe's sword, turning into mist before it even landed on the ground. Arg! Yuna cried out in pain and suddenly called out loudly, "Assassin!" Han Shuo had already rolled out from under the bed after the stab. Lifting his head, he discovered that Phoebe's body was shrouded in black night clothes. A large ball of milky white fighting aura blossomed from the long sword in her hand. The ball of fighting aura was dazzling in the dimly lit room, so blinding that one's eyes couldn't be opened. It was already enveloping Darnell and Yuna, who were trying to escape. Who would have thought that this stab of the dagger would strike Darnell's manhood? No wonder his screams are even more tragic than Yuna's. Han Sho thought with a wicked glee. Phoebe also listened attentively when these words were spoken. It was only a few breaths after Han Sho's voice had sounded that Phoebe finally heard the approaching footsteps. She couldn't help but look at Han Sho in shock and say in a low voice, "No matter how strong or weak you are, your extraordinary senses of foresight are already quite frightening." After experiencing the trials of the dark forest and Claude's death, Han Sho's cautiousness and steadiness had also been silently trained to the point of no return. Add to that Han Sho's astounding senses. This indeed made Han Sho fit the characteristics of a competent assassin. No wonder Phoebe would ask such a question. At this moment, even ordinary people could hear the clatter of footsteps. A man and a woman's teasing laughter sounded from far outside the room, accompanied by the sounds of kissing. Darnell wanted to madly chase after Han Sho when he saw Han Sho immediately stumble backwards, but he suddenly discovered that the long sword in his hand was boiling red. The skin of his right hand that held the sword was burning with unbearable pain, and he immediately threw the long sword away in shock. At this moment Phoebe, who had just descended from the roof, and Han Sho, who had fired an arrow, rushed towards the two at the same time like cheetahs. Phoebe had been planning on dealing with Darnell, but a trace of panic and disgust appeared on her face when she saw Darnell's naked body. She raised her sword and stabbed at Yuna in the blink of an eye. "How did you so miraculously discover the traces of the wind made jealous when he came over?" Phoebe frowned in confusion as she looked at Han Sho while inspecting the interior of the room. Snorting lightly, Phoebe shut her mouth. She couldn't help but exclaim softly after a short while as she noticed Han Sho's movements. "Have you been an assassin before? Why are you so calm and cautious, and have such extraordinary senses? Damned pervert, you'll die under a woman's crotch sooner or later!" At this moment, Han Sho and Phoebe had arrived at the same time. Phoebe stabbed out with her sword, her target already enveloping the two of them. After killing Darnell, Han Sho abruptly set his eyes on the space ring on Darnell's finger. He reached out to remove it, but felt that it was a bit strenuous. At this moment, a faint sound of something piercing through the air suddenly sounded. Han Sho's entire body tensed as he immediately knew that Phoebe had made her move. He focused all of his attention. "Sweetheart, are you in the mood today? Being so wanton at a banquet, who have you taken a fancy to this time?" Darnell laughed lightly and teased Yuna. Spitting out a mouthful of fresh blood, Han Sho was unable to completely defend against Darnell's fierce fighting aura rushing into his body. Although he was restrained by the magical yuan, he immediately stumbled back a few steps. "Heh, I'll let you die under my crotch first. What does that have to do with you? You're just a wild beast who only knows how to think with the lower half of your body. All you're thinking about right now is that little bitch Phoebe. If it wasn't for you making a move against Phoebe last time, we would have completed Grover's mission long ago and killed that little bitch Phoebe. Because of your mistake, her guards arrived in time and we almost didn't make it out," Yuna complained to Darnell as she sat down on the edge of the bed. "Let's go!" Han Sho called out softly, and immediately rushed towards Phoebe's side. A faint fragrance suddenly spread from Phoebe's direction. Han Sho took a whiff and didn't pay much attention to it. When he saw that Phoebe's eyes were a bit odd, he hurried the dazed Phoebe. A barrier of water suddenly appeared amidst the rapid chanting of an incantation. The azure barrier of water covered the two's heads, and suddenly transformed into a sky full of rainwater amidst Phoebe's milky white fighting aura, pouring down on the two's bodies. Han Sho could only hear the sounds from underneath the bed, but Phoebe on the roof had likely already seen all of their movements because she had to pay attention to the two at all times. Because the slightest bit of distraction was not allowed during an assassination, Phoebe couldn't tear her gaze away from the two. According to Darnell's words, Phoebe was still a virgin, and this sort of stimulation was probably even more intense for her than for Han Sho, who couldn't see what was happening below. Han Sho was crouching on the ground at this moment, carefully collecting the powder of the splintered wood on the ground into his space ring. He didn't lift his head and directly responded. "This is my business, it has nothing to do with you. Shut up, you're not allowed to slander my master." My master is a true swordsman, he wouldn't do such a thing! Phoebe's face grew even colder as she glared fiercely at Han Shu. He used the same method to cut off the ring finger of Yuna's left hand, collecting her space ring as well. He casually picked up the crossbow that had been tossed aside earlier and pulled Phoebe with him as he leapt up. Using a hole in the roof that had been opened long ago, the two of them quickly fled along the roof. The two of them had used all their strength to begin with, intending to use the force of their stomps to fly out. However, the collapse of the round table had caused their bodies to lose balance, and they suddenly lost their footing. Their bodies swayed as they fell with the table. You're the one who's been an assassin! Phoebe rolled her eyes coldly at Han Shu and continued. However, my master has taught me knowledge in this area, and the details of assassinating are also part of my homework. Time was of the essence, and Han Shu couldn't help but slash down with his dagger, chopping off the middle finger of Yuna's left hand and putting away the finger with the space ring. Han Shu had already seen a bloody hole in Yuna's chest when he turned his head. It looked like she'd been killed by Phoebe as well. Han Shu's attention was at its highest at this moment. Darnell and Yuna couldn't sense Phoebe's concealment, but Han Shu could already hear Phoebe's heartbeat and breathing quicken. It looked like she was in a state of extreme rage. Inwardly startled, Han Shu couldn't help but conceal himself even more carefully, planning to cooperate with Phoebe at any moment to make a move first. Holding his breath and concentrating, Han Shu's breathing and heartbeat became slower and slower, until it was almost deathly still in the end. His entire mind was a sheet of clarity as Han Shu went through the layout of the various items in the room once again in his mind. Only then did he focus all of his attention on the newcomers. Han Shu and Phoebe had already set up everything in the room after a while. Pfft. Chapter 73. Grover led a group of Buzz Merchant Guild guards and barged into the room as soon as Han Shu had left. Who did it? Who did it? I've spent so much gold coins on you guys for nothing, and yet not a single one of you discovered the assassin's arrival. If the assassin's target was me, I'm afraid that the ones lying on the ground wouldn't be the two of them. Grover immediately flew into a rage as soon as he entered and saw the scene before him. He roared loudly at the people behind him. Mr. Grover, the assassin this time was quite brilliant. He was able to avoid my wind barrier and assassinate both Darnell and Yuna in such a short amount of time. This proves that the assassin's strength is absolutely beyond our imagination. A long-haired man with a slightly dark face spoke to Grover after observing for a while. Breathing out lightly, Grover looked at the long-haired man and said a bit apologetically, I'm sorry, Ellis, I lost my composure a bit. Wind Mage Ellis was still expressionless as he looked at Darnell's dead left hand with some astonishment. He made a light sound and walked closer to Darnell's body. Glancing at Darnell's left hand that had lost a finger, Ellis couldn't help but say suspiciously, the middle finger of Darnell's left hand, where the space ring was worn, has been chopped off. What's going on? Not only Darnell, but even Yuna is the same. Could it be that this assassin killed for the sake of wealth? Grover was also a bit suspicious when he heard Ellis' words and opened his mouth to speak. Impossible! Ellis resolutely denied and then surveyed the surroundings before explaining. If the assassin wanted to kill for wealth, he wouldn't have targeted the two of them because their combined strength is the most difficult to deal with. Not to mention that there are many valuable items in the guild. If he only wanted wealth, he wouldn't have needed to make a move against the two of them. With the strength that the assassin has displayed, he could have easily and soundlessly obtained even more benefits from the Buzz Merchant Guild. Grover thought for a moment after he'd said this and nodded. He said with a dark face, If it wasn't murder for money, then it must be my good niece Phoebe's doing. Who would have thought that she'd endured until now and finally couldn't hold it in any longer? That's right. It must be Phoebe's doing. Darnell and Yuna had personally tried to assassinate Phoebe last time. Although the two of them failed and retreated, I believe that Phoebe definitely knew that they were the ones who did it. After all, Darnell's gaze towards Phoebe was far too obscene and unique. Even I, an outsider, could discern it, and Phoebe, the person involved, should be even more aware. None of us were harmed, and only the two of them died. That was enough to explain the problem. However, it looks like the assassin is a bit greedy, otherwise he wouldn't have forgotten to take the space ring even in such a dangerous situation. When did Phoebe have someone like that by her side? Ellis frowned, speaking slowly as he thought. Grover started and mused for a moment. His face suddenly darkened and he said coldly, I know who it is. It must be that Brian who helped Phoebe kill the 3 shadow ghost experts a while back. I heard from the guards that this person came to Fabian to do business, and should be in need of money. Since his strength was enough to kill the 3 senior swordsmen sent by shadow ghosts, he does indeed have the strength to kill Darnell and Una. Damn it, how did Phoebe buy this kid? I don't know where Phoebe hid him. He hasn't appeared by Phoebe's side since he left the guild last time. I've sent people to keep an eye on him for a long time and still haven't found any traces of him. This is going to be a bit difficult. Ellis nodded and came to a conclusion. It seems like it is indeed him. I think we should throw caution to the wind and get rid of this person first. Otherwise, we can be assassinated by him at any time. All right, pass down the orders. Don't assassinate Phoebe for now. Use all your strength to find the person by Phoebe's side. He's ruined my plans twice. I'm going to make his life a living hell. Grover's face was sinister as he spoke coldly. At this moment, Han Shaw, whom Grover hated to the extreme, had already taken Phoebe far away from the buzzed merchant guild and were hurrying towards her residence in the northern part of the city. Phoebe didn't know what was going on, but her mind was a bit absent-minded and her body was boiling hot. She was practically hurrying along with Han Shaw's constant dragging. The two of them were dressed in night clothes and didn't attract much attention as they darted through small alleys in the middle of the night. However, as they got closer and closer to the northern part of the city guards appeared more and more frequently on the road, forcing Han Shaw to continuously avoid them. At this moment Phoebe, who had originally known to hurry along under Han Shaw's dragging, gradually lost the ability to even move her feet as her body heated up. Out of helplessness, Han Shaw didn't care if Phoebe agreed or not and directly carried Phoebe on his back. In order to avoid the attention of the city guards, Han Shaw temporarily gave up on immediately sending Phoebe back to her residence, and instead brought Phoebe all the way to the cemetery behind the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. That place was the quietest and there wouldn't be anyone patrolling at all. Add to that the fact that Han Shaw was the most familiar with that area. That was the first place he thought of in times of danger. Han Shaw carried Phoebe on his back and circled around the northern part of the city, passing through a few winding paths and entering a forest. He suddenly felt that Phoebe on his back was actually tearing at her own clothes and her hands were unconsciously groping around Han Shaw's body. Startled, Han Shaw's body suddenly stopped. The relaxed Han Shaw could clearly feel Phoebe's ample breasts tightly pressed against his firm back. In that moment, a ball of fire suddenly ignited in Han Shaw's heart, like a single spark setting a prairie ablaze. Add to that Phoebe's restless hands that were unconsciously groping around Han Shaw's chest. It finally stimulated Han Shaw to the point where he couldn't hold back any longer. He put Phoebe down on his back and suddenly picked up Phoebe's alluring and wonderful body. He directly pressed Phoebe's body against a nearby tree and Han Shaw's hands moved in unison, involuntarily reaching towards the forbidden areas on Phoebe's body and massaging them. Even through the nocturnal clothes, Han Shaw could feel the wonderful curves of Phoebe's body. The ample breasts constantly changed shape under Han Shaw's hands. When his big hands wandered around Phoebe's slender thighs and round and perky buttocks, the ecstatic beauty strongly stimulated Han Shaw's senses, causing Han Shaw to involuntarily want to go deeper. The mask had already been pulled off by Phoebe herself. At this moment, Phoebe's starry eyes were blurry and watery, filled with seductive lust. Her beautiful cheeks were red and burning hot, bringing with them a soul-stirring beauty. The faint moans and gasps between her fragrant lips made Han Shaw's heart run wild, and he was about to completely sink into it. With a ripping sound, Han Shaw exerted force with his right hand and directly tore a piece of the nocturnal clothes on Phoebe's chest. Her snow-white skin and towering breasts instantly blossomed in front of Han Shaw. The appearance of a captivating red made Han Sho finally unable to control himself, and he lost control of the strength of his right hand. Ouch, it hurts! At this moment, a weak protest came from Phoebe's small mouth. Because of the pain in her breasts, Phoebe, whose eyebrows were slightly furrowed, finally unconsciously let out a weak cry of pain. His brain suddenly shook, and Han Sho instantly sobered up. Looking at Phoebe's appearance again, he recalled that he had also taken a whiff of the strange fragrance. He immediately understood that this Phoebe seemed to have been drugged with an aphrodisiac. At the same time, he also realized that his loss of reason was probably because he had taken a whiff of the aphrodisiac. After thinking quickly for a moment, Han Sho weighed the pros and cons suddenly and resolutely. He picked up Phoebe again and quickly rushed forward. With regards to this place, Han Sho was very familiar with it. After walking for a short while, he came to the side of a trickling stream. This stream was very narrow, and Han Sho wasn't sure where it flowed to, but Han Sho, who frequented this area, knew that this stream was very shallow. As soon as they arrived, Han Sho carried Phoebe and directly walked into the stream. At this time, it was almost winter, and the weather was already very cold. In the middle of the night, the river was naturally even colder. When Han Sho pressed Phoebe into the river and splashed a few waves of water on Phoebe's head, Phoebe suddenly sneezed a few times. Han Sho also dived into the water. Once the ice-cold river flowed over his head, Han Sho's rush suddenly cooled down, and his body completely calmed down. Bah! Bah! After Phoebe sneezed a few times, her body was affected by the ice-cold river, and her consciousness gradually recovered. After spitting out the cold water in her mouth, the red glow on Phoebe's face gradually disappeared, and her pair of blurred eyes slowly became clear. Where is this? Why am I here? Achoo! Phoebe looked around blankly, and suddenly sneezed again. As she sneezed and lowered her head, Phoebe suddenly saw that her high and soft breasts were actually exposed to the air. The snow-white skin and the bright red on the peak caused a strong stimulation to Phoebe in an instant. Han Sho's face had been slapped. Phoebe's face was almost crazy with anger, and she screamed at Han Sho. Beast, what did you do to me? At this time, Han Sho really did feel a bit guilty. Looking at Phoebe, who was about to go crazy, he stammered and spoke incoherently. When Phoebe saw Han Sho like this, she suddenly burst into tears. In an instant, she lost her usual cold arrogance and solemnity, and started punching and kicking Han Sho without a care for anything else. Water suddenly splashed in the small river, and waves of water flew towards Han Sho. However, it was because of Phoebe that she received a strong stimulation at this time. It caused her to seem to suddenly forget that she was a powerful sword master, and instead, she was like a shrew, punching and kicking Han Sho without any fighting energy or technique. If Phoebe had used fighting energy and attacked with her strength as a sword master, even with Han Sho's initial success in magic, it was likely that Han Sho would be seriously injured if not dead after this series of punches and kicks. But now, this kind of attack landed on Han Sho's strong body, and it was like scratching an itch, without any pain at all. Han Sho endured Phoebe's series of venting with a grimace. It wasn't until Phoebe was tired and her little fists became weaker and weaker that Han Sho finally said with a wry smile, "We've all been drugged, but your body is still clean." When Han Sho said these words, Phoebe became a bit more clear-headed. She stopped what she was doing and stood 2 fists away from Han Sho. She stood in front of Han Sho and sized up Han Sho with a pair of slightly red and swollen eyes. She was a bit afraid of being hit, and said with a trembling voice, "Really? You really didn't do that to me?" Nodding his head affirmatively, Han Sho helplessly raised his right hand and solemnly promised her, "I swear I really didn't do that to you." A trace of rejoicing suddenly appeared on Phoebe's beautiful face that still had traces of tears on it. She was about to open her mouth to say something when she suddenly saw that her chest was exposed. She hurriedly pulled up her night clothes and covered her towering, naked breasts. She raised her head and glared angrily at Han Sho. She gritted her teeth and glared hatefully at Han Sho, growling lowly, Then can you explain why my clothes were torn in front of my chest? Shrugging his shoulders, Han Shuo said with an innocent expression, What does that have to do with me? You lost your reason and tore your clothes. I resisted the temptation and brought you here, using cold water to help you regain your reason. I'm a gentleman, don't misunderstand me. Get the hell out of here, you damn gentleman. You despicable, shameless, and snobbish person. Last time you held my hand and hugged me, but you didn't even say an apology. You purposely took advantage of me in the crack of the fake mountain in the trading firm, but you didn't say an apology either. Now you're even more impudent. I'm going to kill you! Phoebe's face was full of rage as she charged at Han Shuo with bared fangs and brandished claws. After recovering her reason this time, Phoebe had obviously activated her fighting aura. Han Shuo jumped in fright. He knew that Phoebe had probably recalled that the clothes on her chest had been torn by him. He turned around in a sorry state and fled towards the riverbank, crying out his innocence. Miss Phoebe, please listen to my explanation. I also inhaled a mouthful of the aphrodisiac, which caused me to lose control of my emotions. However, I immediately sent you into the river after I came to my senses. In all honesty, I really didn't want to take advantage of you. When you were unconscious, you also reached out and touched my body. You also took advantage of me. Apart from you, no other woman has touched me before. I'm still a virgin, so I'll have a shadow in my heart after being violated by you. I've suffered a great loss, so let's call this even. Please don't pursue the matter any further. As Han Shuo ran in a sorry state, a string of words shot out from his mouth like a cannonball. It was as if he had returned to the time when he had been brought to the moon by Chu Kanglin. When Han Shuo had lost his composure, he had hurled a string of words at Chu Kanglin. The difference was that the last time was a curse, while this time it was an explanation. Shut up, you despicable person who deserves to die 1,000 times over. Don't talk nonsense anymore. At this time, Phoebe's clothes were soaked in water, and her hair was wet. She looked very alluring, but the way she held the long sword in her hand was very fierce. Forget it, I admit that I'm unlucky. I'm leaving first. When you calm down, I'll find you for the black gold ore. Goodbye. Han Shuo knew that it was useless to talk to Phoebe at this time. A woman who had lost her rationality was the scariest magical beast in the world, especially when this woman was a swordswoman. To Han Shuo, the danger she posed was comparable to that of a dragon-like super-magical beast. Sighing at his bad luck, Han Shuo didn't dare to stop. He quickly rushed out, heading in the direction of the tomb. He gradually left Phoebe behind, who was unfamiliar with the terrain. Chapter 74. By the time he'd arrived at the cemetery of death through the transportation matrix, the sky had already begun to brighten. It had been exactly 1 day and 1 night since he'd left and returned. Han Shuo finally breathed a sigh of relief when he hurried to the original demon cave to inject fresh blood and magical yuan. The original demon cave couldn't be stopped for a single day. If he didn't inject fresh blood and magical yuan every day, then all of his efforts over the past 20 days would have been for naught. Sitting down on the ground, Han Shuo's fighting aura finally began to run amok in his body due to Darnell's injection of fighting aura. A sudden impact caused Han Shuo to taste sweetness in his throat, and he almost spat out another mouthful of fresh blood. He was overjoyed instead of shocked. Standing up abruptly, Han Shuo laughed heartily and quickly walked out of the cemetery of death, heading towards the waterfall where he trained his magical yuan. When he arrived at the waterfall, Han Shuo braved the torrential river and sat down in his usual spot. After his body swayed a bit in the beginning, Han Shuo once again sank into training his magical yuan. For 7 days in a row, apart from injecting fresh blood and magical yuan into the original demon cave, at regular intervals, Han Shuo stayed under the waterfall to train his magical yuan. Han Shuo's strength rapidly improved amidst his hard training. Borrowing the fighting aura that Darnell had left in his body and the ferocious impact of the waterfall, the meridians and bones in Han Shuo's chest waist, and abdomen were reforged anew. When Han Shuo felt that Darnell's fighting aura no longer existed, he could clearly feel that his body had become unprecedentedly better. In the next few days, Han Shuo temporarily stopped training his magical yuan and studied the beginner magics of necromancy, while taking care of the original demon cave. He was so familiar with the book that he could almost recite it from memory. Han Shuo had already marked down some of the knowledge that he didn't understand. As he continued to meditate with the round green ball, Han Shuo's mental strength also grew stronger by the day. As Han Shuo continued to experiment, he finally managed to release the spell, Agony of the Soul, one day. At this time, Han Shuo was wild with joy. He understood that after a few months of accumulation and a substantial increase in his mental strength, he had finally advanced from a magic apprentice to a novice mage. A novice mage could grasp the 3 spells of Agony of the Soul, summoning zombies, and bone spears. It was just that after trying for a long time, Han Shuo had only managed to grasp the spell, Agony of the Soul, by chance. As for the other basic zombies and bone spears, Han Shuo couldn't release them no matter how hard he tried. Connecting this to the many areas that he didn't understand when he studied beginner magics of necromancy, Han Shuo understood that blindly reading wasn't a good way to quickly increase his strength. It looked like he needed to find Fanny and ask Fanny about some of the magical knowledge that he didn't understand, as well as retrieve the weapon forging materials and black gold, or that Phoebe had promised him. But before he decided to return, Han Shuo still planned on refining the original demon first. The original demon cave had been in operation for a full 34 days and would be completed in 2 days. Han Shuo wasn't in a hurry to leave, so he first went to the dwarves' village and contacted them. He returned to the mine again and excavated for a day, obtaining a small piece of black iron ore, as well as several dozen pieces of iron and copper ore. Han Shuo understood from Phoebe that black iron ore was an extremely rare and valuable ore. Han Shuo would often only be able to excavate a very small piece after excavating for a day. Therefore, Han Shuo immediately stored the black iron ore into his space ring, and the iron and copper ore were directly thrown into an empty storage room in the Great Hall of the Cemetery of Death when Han Shuo returned to the Cemetery of Death. On the eve that the original demon cave was about to be completed, Han Shuo stayed in the Great Hall of the Cemetery of Death. He thought for a moment, and took out Darnell and Yuna's space rings. Their severed fingers had naturally been removed by Han Shuo a long time ago. The 2 space rings were one black and one green. The black one belonged to Darnell, and the jade green was Yuna's. If the owner didn't die, then the mental imprint of the owner of the space ring would never disappear. Even if the owner entered someone else's space ring, they wouldn't be able to take away the items within. Except, now that Darnell and Yuna were both dead, the mental imprint of the owner of the space ring had naturally disappeared. First, Han Shuo held Darnell's black space ring in his hand and immediately rushed into it after concentrating his mental strength. The space inside was the same as the one Han Shuo had. Apart from a few long swords, bows, and spears, there was also a set of sparkling silver armor, a book on training fighting aura, a few changes of clothes, some aphrodisiacs, a crystal card to store gold coins, and 100 or so scattered gold coins. He took out the clothes and threw them away, and threw the weapons he didn't need into the storage room where the iron and copper ores were stored. The remaining armor, fighting aura book, some aphrodisiacs, and 100 or so gold coins were all placed into his space ring. The crystal card that might have held a large amount of gold coins was basically useless since Darnell was already dead and couldn't be verified. It was also casually thrown into the storage room by Han Shuo. After going through Darnell's space ring, Han Shuo set his sights on Yuna's space ring. It was a sparkling green space ring that was obviously made for a female. It looked quite beautiful and emitted a soft green halo. However, when Han Shuo had gathered his mental strength and was about to enter the space ring, he suddenly felt the existence of a boundary. He couldn't help but curse inwardly. He hadn't thought that Yuna would be so cautious as to set up a boundary within the space ring. Even if she died and her mental imprint disappeared, an enemy who obtained the space ring would need to have a level of mental strength that was one level higher than hers in order to break through the boundary within the space ring and take everything within it. Han Shaw had originally planned on taking everything within Yuna's space ring and giving it to Fanny, but it looked like that wouldn't be possible for the time being. After all, Fanny only had the strength of an adept mage, and there would certainly be other things within the space ring. If he gave it to Fanny, she would definitely know that the space ring wasn't of a legitimate origin. Sighing dejectedly, Han Shaw had no choice but to keep the space ring for the time being. He planned on giving it to Fanny to use after destroying the boundary within. On the last day, Han Shaw walked out of the original demon cave early in the morning. After injecting fresh blood and magical yuan into the original demon cave, he stood around the original demon cave and looked at it with wide eyes, waiting for the appearance of the 3 original demons that he had refined. The original demon cave, that was like a sinister ghost face, was even more frightening after today. Perhaps it was because Han Shaw had injected fresh blood into the original demon cave for 36 days in a row, but the originally grayish-brown original demon cave seemed to have been smeared with a layer of fresh blood. It was an extremely strange red. After the 6 drops of fresh blood had been injected, the remaining 6 wraiths sank into a frenzy of fighting and gnawing. Their bodies that were in a state of incorporeal and incorporeal nibbled and tore at each other, engaging in a final frenzy. Little Skull still appeared to be very relaxed. He crossed his calves as if he was sunbathing on the beach. That kind of contented comfort formed a sharp contrast with the frenzy of the wraiths, devouring each other. Han Shaw stared at the original demon cave and waited for the better part of a day. He watched as the last 6 wraiths interwove together, and finally, balls of dark red blood rose from the original demon cave, completely enveloping the entire original demon cave. Even Han Shaw couldn't clearly see what was going on inside. Following the appearance of the blood energy, a strong wave of yin qi emanated from the original demon cave. Streaks of red light that resembled lightning constantly appeared and suddenly disappeared from within. After an indeterminate amount of time, a crisp crack suddenly sounded from within the original demon cave. Like glass shattering, the various bizarre scenes that enveloped the original demon cave suddenly disappeared without a trace under a gust of chilly wind. 3 dark red illusory figures, dragging a strange long tail behind them, danced merrily around Han Shaw's body, as if rejoicing in the joy of being reborn. An inexplicable feeling spread from the 3 original demons to Han Shaw's heart. Following Han Shaw's thoughts, the 3 original demons obediently flew into the sky, their bodies turning from solid to incorporeal, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. It was as if 3 pairs of eyes had suddenly appeared. The 3 original demons hid their tracks according to Han Shaw's instructions, and were distributed in 3 directions of the cemetery of death. With the help of the 3 original demons, Han Shaw could see the entire cemetery of death in all directions. Not a single place could escape Han Shaw's observation. With a thought, the 3 original demons whistled and arrived in front of Han Shaw. Following Han Shaw's thoughts, they suddenly burrowed into Han Shaw's body, becoming as small as ants, and entrenched themselves on a piece of bone on the back of Han Shaw's neck. "Ha! This is indeed very interesting. With these 3-inch original demons, I have 3 more pairs of eyes. As long as I release them, I won't have to worry about being followed and ambushed. If I use the 3-inch original demons to assassinate others, it'll be the enemy's nightmare." Han Shaw laughed heartily as he continuously released the original demons with his thoughts and absorbed them into his body, practicing tirelessly. It was at this moment that Little Skull, who had been lying in the original demon cave, suddenly stood up and slowly crawled out. The 7 bone spurs on his back actually began to flap rapidly, and his body abruptly shot up into the sky with the strength of his 2 legs. There were 7 bone spurs on his back. 6 of them were arranged in 2 rows, like the wings of an insect. The remaining one went straight to his buttocks, like a tail. As he shot into the sky, he swayed and danced with joy. The 2 rows of bone spurs on his back flapped fiercely, and the tail-like bone spurs swayed continuously. It was like the head of a bicycle, and seemed to be able to help him move agilely in the air. The last tail-like bone spur swayed to the left, and the little body of the little skull fell to the left. When the bone spur swayed to the right, the falling body of the little skull would fall to the right. It was quite a miraculous sight. Han Shuo was dumbfounded as he watched the little skull swaying and falling from the air with a face full of shock. His brain couldn't react for a moment. After a while, the little skull fell from the air with a plop, and the bones all over his body made a series of swaying sounds. The little skull was also dizzy from the fall. After he stood up with the little bone knife, he actually walked around in circles as if he was drunk. "Stinking brat, you've only been walking for a few days, and you already want to fly." Han Shuo looked at the little skull's appearance, and felt extremely distressed. He quickly rushed in front of the little skull and knocked on the little skull's smooth forehead. It was very miraculous. When Han Shuo knocked with his finger, the little skull immediately stopped his drunken swaying and sat down on his butt like a child. He even stretched out his hand and scratched his head, as if he didn't understand what he had done wrong. This little skull had been carefully cared for by Han Shuo since the first time he was summoned by Han Shuo. Under the continuous cultivation of demonic arts, he actually gradually began to move like a human. Han Shuo's feelings for this little skull were deeper than anyone else's in this world. Seeing it fall from the sky, he was really worried to death. When Han Shuo saw that the little skull's skeleton did not fall apart, and other than the bones swaying a little from the fall, there was nothing else. Only then did he let out a sigh of relief. After taking a closer look, he suddenly realized that the originally black bones of the little skull actually carried a faint hint of dark red. It was no longer a pure black color. If he didn't look closely, he might not have noticed it. That's strange. The original demon cave was originally used to refine little demons, but he insisted on going in and even had a look of satisfaction on his face. Now that he's out, his body has changed, and he's even learning from the little original demon whose body is in between reality and illusion to fly. It looks like this stinking brat has changed again. I don't know if this change is good or bad. Even I don't know what this guy looks like now. Han Shuo stared at the little skull and observed it carefully, muttering to himself. After a period of contemplation, when Han Shuo discovered that he was unable to understand the changes in the little skull, he couldn't help but shake his head and stop thinking about it. Looking at the original demon cave that no longer had any abnormalities due to the appearance of the little original demon, Han Shuo chanted a magical incantation and sent the little skull back to the other dimension. Now that his injuries had recovered, the 3 original demons had been refined, and even the little skull had regained its mobility. Thinking of some unsolved magical knowledge and the piece of black gold ore that Phoebe owed him, Han Shuo organized a bit and returned to the Empire's Asan city through the transportation matrix. Chapter 75. Asan City, Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Han Shuo ate breakfast and bought a new set of clothes before arriving at the academy in the morning. Han Shuo first went to the library and surreptitiously put the 2 books he'd entrusted Jack to steal, Foundations of Necromancy and Magical Dictionary, back where they'd been, and then made his way directly to the lab where Fanny was. The door to the lab wasn't closed. Fanny was wearing a black magic robe with gold trimmings and a pair of black-rimmed glasses. She held a magic staff in her left hand and a pen in her right. She was currently drawing magical patterns on a round table in the middle of the room, explaining something incessantly. Fitch, who was beside her, put on an attentive appearance, but his eyes often lingered on Fanny's face. Fanny, wearing glasses, was less charming and bright, and had more of a serious and intellectual beauty. This didn't diminish her beauty in the slightest in Han Shuo's eyes, and he also looked deeply at Fanny with a bit of intoxication. Fanny lifted her head to look at the dumbfounded Fitch after a round of explanations and asked with a frown, "Fitch, do you understand?" Fitch was instantly roused from his reverie and nodded, smiling faintly. "Master Fanny, you've explained very clearly. I understand now." When Fanny lifted her head to look at Fitch, she saw Han Shaw standing in front of the door. Han Shaw was now a bit taller than Fitch, and his body appeared quite valiant due to his constant training and battles. He stood there with a straight back, like a javelin, and didn't have the slightest trace of a mage's frail appearance. Fanny was stunned at first, seeming to be a bit surprised by Han Shaw's unwitting changes. But when Fanny saw Han Shaw looking at her with an intoxicated expression, she couldn't help but panic and blush. She tightened her grip on the pen in her right hand and almost snapped it in half. "What's wrong with me?" Fanny exclaimed inwardly and involuntarily took a deep breath. She glared at Han Shaw with a bit of resentment, then raised her head and snorted. "Brian, long time no see. You disappeared for a month after the last trial. Where have you been fooling around? Why have you come back to the academy now?" Han Shaw's expression immediately returned to normal when he heard Fanny speak. He laughed lightly and walked rudely into the room without waiting for Fanny's greeting. He responded, "The last trial in the dark forest made me understand of my shortcomings, so I borrowed a magic book and crammed some foundational knowledge of magic. I've come to consult Master Fanny because I've run into many problems. I come. Humph, who'd believe you? You're always so secretive." Fanny rolled her eyes at Han Shaw, obviously not believing Han Shaw's words. She turned her head to look at Fitch and felt that Fitch's presence was a bit of an eyesore. She instructed, "Fitch, I still have some matters to discuss with Brian alone. Since you've understood my explanation just now, then go back and practice well." Fitch started, seeming not to have thought that Fanny would tell him to leave because of Han Shaw's appearance. He stared blankly for a while before glaring hatefully at Han Shaw. He said lowly, "An errand boy will always be an errand boy. He doesn't look like a true student even when he's wearing the uniform." Fitch finally left after he'd finished speaking. A smile hung on Han Shaw's face from beginning to end, and he paid no mind to Fitch's low mutterings. Han Shaw understood that Fitch still held a grudge against him because of Fanny's attitude towards him. However, before Fitch could express this hatred through action, Han Shaw couldn't be bothered to care about him. "Go, close the door tight." Fanny put down the pen in her hand as soon as Fitch left and swept a glance at Han Shaw. She opened her mouth and gave her orders in a grandiose manner. "Close the door?" Han Shaw's heart trembled and he looked meaningfully at Fanny. A strange smile appeared on his face as he hastily stood up and said, all right, I'll go close the door now." When Han Shaw was in high spirits and happily closed the door to the lab, Fanny swept another glance at Han Shaw and continued to instruct. "You get on the bed first." Nodding his head like a chicken pecking at rice, Han Shaw didn't even say much this time as he took off his shoes and lay down on the white bed in the back. Proudly crossing his legs, Han Shaw smiled and said, "Master Fanny, come over here too." Fanny looked at Han Shaw with an amused expression and purposefully responded, "I'm coming, close your eyes first." Han Shaw had never been so well behaved before. With dirty thoughts in his heart, he very obediently closed his eyes and a lascivious smile blossomed on his face. "Ah!" A ghastly scream emitted from Han Shaw's mouth. In that moment, Han Shaw suddenly felt an enormous mental strength invade his brain and jolt Han Shaw awake from his sweet dreams. When Han Shaw saw Fanny looking at him with a smile, he asked with a bit of anger, "Master Fanny, what are you doing? Helping you examine your body. Didn't I say last time that you're my test subject? When we arrive at the academy, I'll make use of the academy's facilities to conduct a thorough examination for you. That's what I did just now. What do you think I told you to close the door and get on the bed for?" Fanny had a deadpan expression as she glared at Han Shaw. However, even though she was wearing glasses, it couldn't hide the smug smile of having succeeded in her scheme behind her glasses. The current Han Shaw was no longer the same as he was in the past. He saw the smugness in Fanny's eyes with one glance. He couldn't help but smile wryly as he sat up from the bed and said to Fanny, "Forget it, don't continue to examine me in the future. This kind of thing can't be explained with common sense. If you use that method to invade my brain and turn me into an idiot, then my life will be over." Fanny furrowed her brow slightly in thought when she heard Han Shuo's words. She thought for a bit and sighed involuntarily. She then said with a smile, "Forget it then. I'm willing to lose a test subject, but I can't lose a talented student." Han Shuo also breathed a sigh of relief when he saw that Fanny had let him off the hook so easily. He thanked Fanny from the bottom of his heart and took out the Beginner Magics of Necromancy book, asking Fanny about some of the areas he didn't understand. Fanny looked at Han Shuo with surprise when she saw that Han Shuo had taken out the Beginner Magics of Necromancy book from his space ring and saw that many of the areas had been annotated by Han Shuo. She exclaimed softly, "You're already reading this book? Have you already grasped all the spells that a magic apprentice should know? Oh, you've even added a lot of annotations. It looks like you really haven't been slacking off during this time. I've misunderstood you. Of course, I've already grasped all the spells that a magic apprentice should know," Han Shuo said with a smile. He thought for a moment and released the agony of the soul spell in front of Fanny, causing Fanny to cry out again in shock. "Oh my gosh! Brian, you're really too incredible. You actually have enough mental strength to release the agony of the soul spell. This means that your mental strength has indeed reached the level of a novice mage. You're a genius, a true genius." Han Shuo wasn't sure if he was a genius, but Han Shuo knew that the reason why his mental strength could increase so quickly was because of that strange green ball. Even now, Han Shuo still didn't know what this green ball was, but he was sure that it had something to do with the Cemetery of Death. After Fanny's series of exclamations, Han Shuo began to seriously ask Fanny about the magic knowledge that he didn't understand. As an adept mage, Fanny had always been doing her homework on how to teach her students about magic. She was very familiar with the basics and patiently explained each and every difficult problem to Han Shuo. The two of them were very close during this process, and Han Shuo could smell the delicate fragrance on Fanny's body. The two of them looked at each other during the explanation. Because of some common understandings, there was a tacit feeling of mutual admiration. Fanny didn't seem to dislike Han Shuo's closeness. Every time Han Shuo clearly understood what she was saying, she'd slap Han Shuo's shoulder in praise. Unknowingly, the two of them had talked for a few hours in Fanny's lab. Fanny didn't show the slightest bit of impatience, but rather seemed to enjoy meeting a good student. It wasn't until a bell rang that Fanny was startled back to her senses. She exclaimed softly, "Oh no, I almost forgot that I have to go to the training fields for lessons in the afternoon. Brian, your powers of comprehension are quite good. It looks like you're on the right path in learning necromancy magic. But let's stop here for today. I have to go to the training fields for lessons. Do you want to come with me?" Shaking his head, Han Shuo smiled. "Forget it, I've already mastered some of the low-level magic. I've understood many things from you today, and I need to think about them in private. I won't be going to the training fields." Nodding, Fanny didn't force the issue. She hurriedly packed up and picked up a book to straighten out her clothes. She said, "That's a good idea. You can come find me alone in the next couple of days and I'll help you explain everything you don't understand. Oh, right, Lisa seems to be quite worried about you after you've been gone for so long. She even asked me where you went. Heh, I'm fine. Tell her not to worry. I'll be leaving now as well. I'll be bothering you often in the next couple of days. Thank you, Master Fanny, in advance." Han Shuo spoke carelessly, and left Fanny's lab ahead of her. He thought for a bit and avoided crowded areas, walking out of the academy. After leaving the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force, Han Shuo very carefully bypassed two paths before sneaking towards Phoebe's residence. After experiencing the assassination attempt at the Buzz Merchant Guild last time, Han Shuo had a faint feeling that something was amiss. Not only had he offended Grover, but even Phoebe would likely hold a grudge against him. However, for the sake of the black gold ore, Han Sho had no choice but to steel himself and come find Phoebe again. He could only hope that Phoebe's anger had already subsided after 10 days. It was the old steward who opened the door again. Fabian rushed over after hearing the news when Han Sho walked in. He was still smiling when he saw Han Sho and said, "Brian, what brings you here?" Smiling wryly, Han Sho shook his head and sighed. "Don't mention it. I helped your Miss kill Darnell and Yuna at the Buzz Merchant Guild last time. However, I don't know how I offended your Miss Phoebe. Not only did I not receive any compensation, but I was even beaten up by her. How unlucky! Oh, although Miss Phoebe comes from a wealthy family, she's not an unreasonable person. What's going on between you and Miss Phoebe? In any case, she's been angry for the next few days after she returned in the middle of the night. I even overheard her cursing you for being shameless, despicable, and lowly. I really don't understand what would make her so angry." Fabian looked at Han Sho with surprise and spoke slowly, deep in thought. With a wry face, Han Sho sighed lowly again and said, "Forget it, let's not talk about those things. I have no choice but to come find her for the sake of my materials. Is Miss Phoebe home right now?" "Apologies, the Miss has left and isn't home for the time being. However, I think she'll be back soon. If you're not in a hurry, you can wait here for a while." "All right then, I'll wait for her for a while." Indeed, not long after, Han Sho's ears could already hear the sound of someone knocking on the door from afar. He couldn't help but feel nervous as he thought about how he should speak to Phoebe when he saw her later. Just as Han Sho's brow was furrowed in deep thought, a man's soft exclamation sounded. "Eh? You're Brian, right? What are you doing here?" Han Sho started and immediately raised his head to look. He discovered that Lawrence, who'd spent 5 gold coins to hire him as a human target, was actually standing in front of the door with Phoebe. "Senior brother Lawrence, you know him?" Outside the door, Phoebe looked at Lawrence in surprise and spoke with a bit of surprise. "Of course, he's Brian, an errand boy of our Babylon Academy of Magic and Force," Lawrence responded matter-of-factly. "Errand boy?" Phoebe and Fabian exclaimed at the same time. Phoebe sized up Han Sho with a strange expression, but said to Lawrence, "Senior brother, your Babylon Academy of Magic and Force is the most renowned school in the Empire. How can there be such a despicable, shameless, and lowly person?" Lawrence started when these words were spoken and shrugged at Han Sho, smiling at Phoebe. "Junior sister, how has Brian offended you? I rather admire Brian's persevering and indomitable character." Han Sho's face was wry as he sat there and didn't respond. He lowered his head and drank his tea, cursing inwardly. He hadn't thought that this Lawrence would be Phoebe's senior brother. Now that his identity had been exposed, if Phoebe insisted on pursuing what had happened back then, it would be a bit troublesome even if he wanted to hide. Chapter 76. "Senior brother Lawrence, come with me, I'll give you what you need." Phoebe couldn't help but speak to Lawrence when she saw that Han Sho didn't say anything, only drinking mouthful after mouthful of water with a wry expression on his face. She seemed to find it boring as well and couldn't help but speak to Lawrence. Before leaving, Phoebe glared hatefully at Han Sho with her bright eyes. She paused and said, "If you're not in a hurry, wait for me for a while." Han Sho lifted his head to look at Phoebe, and clearly felt Phoebe's suppressed anger. He remembered that he still needed to rely on her for the demon's lair edge and immediately nodded helplessly. Phoebe led Lawrence to the side. Fabian looked at Han Sho with an extremely odd expression when he saw them leave. He asked in astonishment, "Brian, you're only an errand boy at the academy? My goodness, but you have such high strength. What's going on?" "Nothing's going on. Oh right, this Lawrence is an ordinary journeyman knight at our academy, but Miss Phoebe has the strength of a sword master. How come the two of them have the same master?" Han Sho was quite puzzled and asked Fabian. Although knights and swordsmen could practice the same fighting aura, they both had the same master. Lawrence was only a journeyman knight, but Phoebe had the strength of a sword master. The difference between the two was too great. Han Shuo had heard from the two that Lawrence was the senior brother, and Phoebe the junior sister. This made Han Shuo feel even more puzzled. I'm not very clear about the Miss situation either. I was only an insignificant character in the Buzzed Merchant Guild before. I've only heard that before the chairman died, the Miss was studying outside and only came back once or twice a year. If it wasn't for the chairman's sudden death, Miss Phoebe likely wouldn't have suddenly stayed behind. Lawrence also only appeared in my sights recently. They seem to have a good relationship, but I have no way to answer your questions. Fabian looked apologetically at Han Shuo and opened his mouth to explain. Han Shuo didn't ask any more questions after hearing his words. He nodded and frowned in thought. After a while, Phoebe and Lawrence once again stood in front of the door. Phoebe looked at Fabian and instructed. Fabian, help me see senior brother Lawrence out. I have some things to discuss with Mr. Bryan in private. Yes, miss. Fabian sensibly stood up and walked towards the door. Bryan, I'm very happy to see you here. If you still want to earn a few more gold coins, you can come find me at any time. However, I don't think you need it anymore. Alright, goodbye Bryan, I think we'll have a chance to meet again in the future. Lawrence looked meaningfully at Han Shuo and smiled lightly as he walked outside with Fabian. Phoebe walked in with a cold face as soon as the two left. She flicked a glance at Han Shuo after sitting down and snorted lightly. You still dare to see me? Why wouldn't I dare? Han Shuo's eyebrows rose and he stared at Phoebe without backing down. I haven't done anything wrong, not to mention you still owe me something. As long as you give me the materials and black gold or you promised, I'll leave immediately and won't do business with you in the future. Slap! Phoebe slammed the table and glared at Han Shuo angrily. You still have the face to ask for things from me? Damn it, you violated me. I'm already being polite by not killing you. Nonsense, you and I were both under the influence of aphrodisiac back then. I was the one who pulled you away from the Buzzed Merchant Guild, otherwise you'd already be done for. Not to mention, I didn't really do anything to you, otherwise I wouldn't have carried you into the river. Han Shuo was truly angry now. He thought to himself that he'd worked so hard for an entire night, and not only had he not gotten a single thing, he'd even been beaten up by her. There was no need to mention how much he treated Phoebe at that time, yet this Phoebe was still harping on this matter. Could it be that she really wanted to renege on her debt? Clang! Phoebe unsheathed her long sword and glared angrily at Han Shuo. Han Shuo also slammed the table and immediately stood up. He glared fiercely at Phoebe, as if he was going to fight to the death with a single word of disagreement. The two stared at each other and maintained this posture for nearly a minute. Phoebe pouted and put her longsword back into its scabbard with a clang. She turned her head away from Han Shuo and said coldly, What exactly do you want? Very simple, I'll buy the other materials at the price you gave me and return the black gold, or you owe me. Our debt will be written off. We won't have anything to do with each other in the future, and I won't continue to do any bullshit business with you. Han Shuo sat down with a gloomy face and drank the water in front of him in one gulp, speaking crisply. You despicable snob, here you go, all of it is yours. Now get out. Phoebe flared up with anger for no reason when she heard Han Shuo's words. Her expression was one of uncontrollable fury as she took out a large bag of items from her space ring in a somewhat irritable manner. She put it down with a clang and pushed it in front of Han Shuo, glaring fiercely at Han Shuo as she spoke. You've already prepared everything? Why didn't you say so earlier? You've hurt our friendship for nothing. Han Shuo was planning to take the items and leave when he saw that the bag of items had been placed in an orderly manner. There was a strange piece of metal in the middle and it was contained in a small transparent bottle. The two words, black gold, were written on the bottle. It looked like Phoebe had already prepared everything and had no intention of going back on her word. However, what puzzled Han Shuo was that since Phoebe clearly had no intention of going back on her word, why was she so hostile as soon as she walked in? She even said that she didn't plan on giving him anything. This was quite baffling to Han Shuo. Give me your crystal card and I'll transfer the gold that should be given to you into your crystal card. Heh. I actually don't have any other intentions, I just want to take back what belongs to me. Han Sho smiled a bit awkwardly, but still put the bag of items into his space ring first. He then smiled sheepishly at Phoebe. Still not looking straight at Han Sho, Phoebe's face was cold and haughty as she said in a distant tone. No need, I'm not as stingy as you. It's only 3,500 gold, just take it as a gift from me. Don't let me see you in the future, scram! Han Sho's face stiffened when he saw that she was still mocking him. He nodded and put down a piece of black iron ore that he had mined the day before with a bang. He said in the same cold voice, I don't like to owe favors to strangers. This piece of black iron ore will be my compensation for purchasing your other ores. Goodbye, Miss Phoebe. I won't do business with you in the future. Just as Han Sho was about to leave the room with a resolute expression, Phoebe suddenly stood up and looked at Han Sho with a face full of confusion. Her wise eyes were full of weakness and fatigue as she said to Han Sho in distress. Stranger? You treat me as a stranger? Shrugging his shoulders, Han Sho said suavely. Since you don't treat me as a friend, of course I won't shamelessly stick to you. After saying this, Han Sho smiled freely and walked out of the room. But before Han Sho could walk out the door, Phoebe suddenly called out softly. Wait! Looking back at Phoebe, Han Sho asked calmly. Miss Phoebe, is there anything else? Phoebe's expression was a bit odd as she lowered her head in silence. When she lifted her head, most of the weakness and fatigue on her face had disappeared. Her gaze that looked straight at Han Sho made Han Sho feel very odd. In the end, Phoebe even curled the corners of her mouth and revealed a faint smile, saying, Brian, you're saying that you already treat me as a friend? Astonished, Han Sho nodded and replied matter-of-factly. Of course, we've gone through 2 life-and-death situations together at the Buzz Merchant Guild. Not to mention that you've helped me out a bit. I already treat you as a friend, it's just that you don't want to. Who says I don't want to? Humph, apart from monetary transactions, are you so heartless to all your friends? At this time, Phoebe's expression had actually returned to normal again. She had a bit more humanity than usual and spoke to Han Sho with the same attitude she had spoken to Lawrence earlier. Of course not. Han Sho responded. Very good, since we're friends, I have some things to tell you. Phoebe's expression was sincere as she thought for a bit and stared at Han Sho. Brian, after we assassinated Darnell and Yuna last time, Grover thought that you were the culprit. He teamed up with Shadow Ghost to fully investigate your origins. You told him that you were Brian at that time, so I think that it won't be long before he finds out that you're at the Academy. Unless you leave the Academy and abandon the name Brian and live with a different identity, you'll have an endless amount of trouble. Phoebe's words were filled with sincere concern. Han Sho could clearly feel it, and felt a bit of warmth in his heart. His expression also softened a bit. After thinking carefully, Han Sho felt that Phoebe's words shouldn't be a problem. He frowned and said to Phoebe, Then, what do you think I should do? Come with me and get rid of Grover. Otherwise, we'll never have a day of peace. Phoebe's charming face was frosty as she spoke word by word. After musing for a bit, Han Sho suddenly felt that a life surrounded by danger seemed to be more suitable for him to break through his limits. His life before had been too monotonous. Perhaps a bit of excitement would be more interesting. Add to that what Phoebe had said, if he didn't get rid of Grover's threat, he would likely have endless troubles. After musing for a bit, Han Sho said resolutely, All right, I promise you. Then, accompany me to the Buzz Merchant Guild's private banquet tonight. Some of the guild's founding elders will also be present at the banquet. Phoebe's charming face lit up with joy when she saw that Han Sho had agreed and immediately said, What am I going to do at the banquet your Buzz Merchant Guild is holding? Han Sho started and asked. Win the goodwill of the other founding elders and be on guard against the old thing schemes. Brian, I need your help. You just said that we're friends, right? Phoebe stared fixedly at Han Sho and asked. Han Sho suddenly felt like he'd boarded a pirate ship. He felt a bit strange, but he had indeed gone along with Phoebe's intentions earlier and admitted that the two were friends. There was no way to back out now, and Hans Shaw could only brace himself and agree. Exclaiming softly, Phoebe said with a smile, "That's great. Wait a moment, I'll have someone make a fitting robe for you. I also need to teach you some basic etiquette for nobles. I've just learned from Lawrence that you're from the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. I think you're not very good at these things." Hans Shaw looked unhappily at Phoebe and said, "I was an errand boy, but that's all in the past. There's no one I can't meet or speak of. My apologies, Brian, I didn't mean anything else, really." Phoebe couldn't help but feel a bit worried when she saw Hans Shaw like this and hastily apologized sincerely. "It's all right, tell me, I'll listen seriously." Hans Shaw waved his hand carelessly, indicating for Phoebe to quickly start. This is black iron ore." As if she just discovered it, Phoebe looked at the black iron ore that Hans Shaw had placed on the table and looked at Hans Shaw with a face full of astonishment. She asked, "You actually have black iron ore? It looks like you're planning on forging the best weapon." "Of course." Hans Shaw responded affirmatively. After that, Phoebe explained the simple etiquette of nobles to Hans Shaw. Hans Shaw understood that if he wanted to climb to a higher level in this world, these necessary etiquettes did indeed need to be mastered. Therefore, he listened earnestly to Phoebe's explanation and even tried to perform some basic etiquette actions according to Phoebe's requests. When night fell, Hans Shaw changed into the formal attire that Phoebe had specially prepared for him and looked quite decent. He followed behind Phoebe and rode the carriage to the Buzzed Merchant Guild for the third time. Many luxurious carriages were parked in front of the door. The guards had been changed again, and they were two unfamiliar faces to Hans Shaw. When Phoebe and Hans Shaw alighted from the carriage together, they didn't need the guards to greet them and walked in with familiar ease. Phoebe led the way through 2 corridors and appeared at the entrance to the banquet. "Niece Phoebe, this is our guild's private banquet. It doesn't seem very appropriate for you to bring him in, does it?" In front of the banquet, Grover held a goblet full of fine wine and was chatting cheerfully with a few obviously wealthy guild elders. When he saw Phoebe and Hans Shaw walk in, he first glared venomously at Hans Shaw before speaking to Phoebe. "Uncle Grover, this Mr. Brian isn't an outsider." Phoebe pursed her lips and laughed lightly. She looked a bit bashfully at Hans Shaw and explained. "Oh? Then good niece, can you tell me why he's not an outsider?" Grover narrowed his eyes and sized up Phoebe like a venomous snake, speaking in an enigmatic tone. "He's my boyfriend." Phoebe raised her head and looked Grover in the eye without fear, saying proudly. Chapter 77. Boyfriend. Grover was startled and looked Phoebe up and down with an extremely odd gaze. He then looked at Hans Shaw with an even more odd gaze, as if he couldn't believe it, and confirmed once more. "Is he really your boyfriend?" "Of course." Phoebe nodded affirmatively, and reached out with a blushing arm to hold Hans Shaw's left hand, as if to prove their relationship. As if an egg had been shoved into his mouth, Hans Shaw's mouth gaped wide open with a dazed look on his face. He only reacted when he felt Phoebe's small hand secretly tighten around his arm. He laughed dryly and nodded, but didn't open his mouth to explain anything. An elder of the trading firm who was chatting cheerfully with Grover couldn't help but ask Grover in a low voice, "What's the background of this kid?" Grover didn't say much and only shot a look at the person, then moved aside a bit and said with a smile, "Since he's Phoebe's boyfriend, then there's no problem. Hurry up and come in." Forcefully pulling Hans Shaw along, Phoebe's expression was as usual as she walked into the great hall. She smiled at a few of the elders along the way and then pulled Hans Shaw towards a place with fewer people. Inside the great hall, waiters were carrying platters of fruit and fine wine, placing them on a wide square table in the center. An enormous chandelier hung overhead, emitting bright light. The entire great hall was decorated magnificently, surprising a country bumpkin like Hans Shaw quite a bit. However, what surprised Hans Shaw the most was Phoebe's words just now. When he saw that there was no one around, Han Sho immediately smiled wryly at Phoebe. I say, Miss Phoebe, what do you mean by this? Casually picking up a goblet, Phoebe poured herself a cup of rosy fine wine and gracefully took a sip. She then said, Don't think too much, I'm just finding a cover for your identity. There's no other meaning. If I didn't say this, I'm afraid you wouldn't have been able to come in at all. Nodding, Han Sho sighed helplessly and said, I knew that nothing good would come out of coming with you. You have to act a bit more naturally, I'll help you deal with it. This is our guild's annual gathering, and all the elders will be here. As bold as Grover is, he wouldn't dare make a move at this time, so we don't have to worry. Phoebe spoke softly to Han Sho, but her eyes continuously scanned the surroundings. Similarly picking up a goblet and pouring half a cup of wine, Han Sho took a sip and felt that it was quite sweet and sour. After a moment of careful observation, Han Sho discovered that many of these Buzz Merchant Guild members had brought their families as well. There were 20 to 30 people in the Great Hall, and among them were old elders, handsome youths, as well as a few attractive women and dignified young ladies. Without exception, all of these people were richly dressed and their actions were refined and courteous. It looked like this was the style of the so-called upper class. Grover held a goblet in one hand as he shuttled back and forth among these people, greeting everyone kindly and appearing to be quite familiar with them. The Buzz Merchant Guild has always been controlled by our Buzz family. My father was originally the chairman, but because I've always been traveling, the old thing temporarily took over the position when my father died. However, don't look at how he seems to be on good terms with many of the elders. No one really knows what's going on behind the scenes. Otherwise, it would be useless for me to come back. Phoebe explained to Han Sho in a low voice as Han Sho silently observed the surroundings. Han Sho's thoughts raced when he heard Phoebe's words and he suddenly said, Your father, how did he suddenly die? Did you not know anything about it beforehand? A trace of murderous intent flashed through Phoebe's eyes when she heard this question. She then lowered her voice and said with a cold face, I'm still investigating how my father died and haven't found any evidence yet. Because I've never been in the guild, there are many things I'm not clear on. The elders likely don't believe me and their attitudes are all uncertain. What I need to do now is win the support of these elders. Otherwise, I won't be able to shake the old thing's position in the guild with my own strength alone. Han Sho understood from Phoebe's words that she was also suspicious of his father's death. He didn't say anything else and held his goblet as he observed the people in the hall, silently weighing his options. After a while, a few more people arrived in succession. Finally, an old man with grizzled sideburns walked into the great hall with the help of a steward. Many people in the hall came over to greet this person when he appeared. When Phoebe saw this, she immediately pulled Han Sho along and hurried over. She quickly explained in a low voice, He's Andrew. He founded the Buzz Merchant Guild with my grandfather. He's one of the most senior members of the guild now, and even Grover doesn't dare be too presumptuous in front of him. If he helps us, we won't be so passive. Phoebe bowed in a reserved manner when she arrived in front of Andrew and said with a joyful smile, Grandpa Andrew, why have you come as well? It's our beautiful little Phoebe. Grandpa hasn't seen you in a long time. You've grown so tall. Andrew's left hand leaned on a cane and his right hand was supported by a steward as he chuckled merrily at Phoebe. Good niece, don't just talk and hurry up and let the old man sit in the hall. The old man is getting on in years and must be very tired after riding the carriage all the way here. He can't stand like this anymore. Grover said this to Phoebe when he came over and walked towards Andrew, seeming to want to take Andrew to sit on his side. It's fine. Little Phoebe and I had a great time chatting. It's been a long time since we've seen our little Phoebe. Andrew avoided Grover's support and lifted his cane instead, walking towards Phoebe and Han Sho. Grover's brow furrowed involuntarily as he watched Phoebe lead Andrew to the other side with a face full of surprise. His gaze roamed over Andrew's body, seeming to be thinking about something. When Phoebe, Andrew, and Han Sho had walked to the other corner of the hall and sat down, Grover had already raised his wine cup and chuckled. Founding Elders of the Buzz Merchant Guild, today is our Buzz Merchant Guild's annual gathering. I'm very happy to be able to see all of you again this year. It's a pity that my dear brother has passed away due to his health. This is a truly tragic matter. Don't be sad, Grover. Currently, the Chamber of Commerce is in good order under your management. I think the president would be very pleased if he knew of your hard work. One of the founding members suddenly spoke up. As soon as he spoke, another two people beside him echoed. Han Sho watched these people's performance with cold eyes. He already had an idea in his heart, and understood that these people must have a close relationship with Grover. They were only expressing their attitudes by saying this. At this moment, Han Sho, who was sitting next to Phoebe, clearly heard Andrew give an extremely low snort. Phoebe was closer to Andrew and naturally heard it clearly. She couldn't help but look at Andrew with pleasant surprise and exchange a look with Han Sho. The chairman has passed away, but our Buzz Merchant Guild can't keep the chairman's position empty forever. I think we should take advantage of this time's gathering to properly discuss the matters of the new chairman. What do you all think? The same person raised his voice and spoke up. The two founding elders who had responded earlier spoke up again to express their agreement. Grover's face was calm as he sat there, continuously surveying the surroundings. His gaze lingered on Phoebe and Andrew for a bit longer. Of course, the chairman's position can't be left empty for too long, but the question of who will be the chairman is an important one. A broad-headed founding elder spoke up in a low, muffled voice not too far away. What's there to discuss? Of course Grover should be the new chairman. After the chairman passed away, Grover has always been in charge of the guild's business. The guild has been stable and orderly in Grover's hands. Everyone has seen that. Apart from Grover, I don't think anyone else has the right to sit in this position. The person named Grover abruptly stood up and raised his voice, winning the agreement of the other two. Grover stood up with a smile on his face and put on a modest and hypocritical expression. He'd said some things about his limited abilities and that he didn't dare take on the role, but the other three had firmly expressed that he was the only one. They couldn't disguise their expressions of disdain and disdain. Han Sho was startled and finally understood that Phoebe's worries weren't without reason. It looked like he'd underestimated the power of Grover and Shadow Ghost. He hadn't thought that they'd be able to discover his origins with just a name. It was a good thing that he'd spent most of his time in the cemetery of death these days. Otherwise, if he'd stayed in the academy, he might have long since been assassinated by experts. Uncle, what do you mean by this? Phoebe suddenly stood up at this moment, and glared angrily at Grover with a frosty face. She wanted to shed all pretense of cordiality and yell. Good niece, don't be angry. I just want to tell everyone that your foresight doesn't seem to be very good. In order to be in charge of the Buzz Merchant Guild, foresight and wisdom are the most important. If you have to choose your future husband from among the slaves, then I think everyone won't be at ease in letting you be the chairman. Grover still wore a peaceful smile on his face, but the words he spoke were quite malicious. A person who would murder his own brother for the sake of profit, and continuously send out killers to harm his own niece, I think he's even more unworthy of the chairman's position. Han Sho also stood up and looked at Grover with a cold, fearless smile, as if he didn't know how deadly his words were. Pausing, Han Sho spoke again under the astonished gazes of everyone present. Please remember, I am now a student of the Babylon Academy. I no longer have the status of a slave, and never will in the future. Chapter 78. Shut up, don't make slanderous accusations. Big brother and I have a deep relationship, how could I do such a thing? Good niece, how could you find such a boyfriend who doesn't see the big picture? Uncle truly feels sorry for you. Grover's expression immediately changed as he stood up with a rumble and slammed the table, roaring angrily. His expression as usual, Han Sho laughed lightly and said with a laugh, Everyone knows that as the only daughter of the chairman, Phoebe should be the most qualified candidate to succeed the position of chairman. If she were to be assassinated, Who would benefit the most? When has it ever been an outsider's turn to speak about the matters of our Buzz Merchant Guild? Phoebe, you should properly discipline this outsider who doesn't know anything. Grover glared viciously at Han Shu, and then turned his head to speak to Phoebe. Phoebe had already calmed down by this time from her earlier panic. She'd always maintained an amiable facade with Grover, but who would have thought that Han Shu wouldn't care at all and would be so diametrically opposed from the start, almost immediately shedding all pretense of cordiality with Grover and disrupting all of her steps. She didn't know what to do for a moment. However, when Han Shu and Grover were refuting each other, Phoebe's thoughts changed and she felt that Han Shu's actions were rather straightforward. Because of Han Shu's actions, Phoebe's attitude was clearly expressed in front of these elders. This also let them see that she, Phoebe, wasn't a weak person who didn't want to fight for things. Except, now wasn't the time to weigh gains and losses. Since Han Shu had already expressed himself so sharply, Phoebe couldn't do anything even if she wanted to. She immediately said confidently after Grover had finished speaking, "That's right, Uncle Grover. I think I'm qualified to be the chairman of the guild. Although I've been traveling all these years, my father has never given up on teaching me. Moreover, the knowledge I've learned is also related to managing the company. This is all arranged by my father. I hope that Uncle can support me. If there's anything I'm lacking in, Uncle can also teach me. I'm confident that I can manage the company well. Good niece, your courage is commendable, but this kind of matter is not child's play. A single careless mistake can send the trading company into a situation of eternal damnation. Uncle is cowardly and cannot bear this kind of responsibility." Since they had shed all pretense of cordiality, Grover no longer concealed anything and spoke with a dark expression. It was at this moment that Andrew suddenly stood up shakily with the support of his walking stick. He said, "There's no point in continuing to argue like this. How about this? Why don't we let little Phoebe try first? If the company can develop smoothly in her hands within 3 months, then we'll let Phoebe be the president. Otherwise, it'll be Grover. What does everyone think?" With Andrew's words, apart from the 3 elders who favored Grover, all the other elders expressed their agreement. Andrew waited until everyone had voted before looking at Grover with a smile. He said merrily, "Since the majority has agreed, I think we'll leave it at that for the time being. What do you think?" No matter how unwilling he was in his heart, Grover felt that he couldn't change anything now that the majority of the elders of the company had agreed. In the end, he could only brace himself and say helplessly, "Since that's the case, then we'll do as you wish." Nodding, Andrew smiled. "All right then, I still have some matters to attend to, so I'll be leaving first. Oh, little Phoebe, Grandpa hasn't seen you in a long time. If there's nothing else, why don't you come with me to my house for a chat?" "All right, I was just about to ask Grandpa for some experience in managing the company." Phoebe stood up with a smile and put down her wine cup. She gave Han Shu a look and didn't even look at Grover as she walked out the door. Han Shu put down his wine cup in understanding and flashed a cold smile of disdain at Grover, who was looking at him with a dark expression. He followed behind Phoebe and also walked out of the hall. As soon as they left the company, Phoebe looked around to make sure that no one was around and said softly to Han Shu, "Go back to my residence first. I'll hurry back after chatting with Grandpa Andrew for a bit. We'll talk later." "Heh, little Phoebe, this boyfriend of yours is quite bold. He actually went head-to-head with Grover in the hall. I think you have good taste." Andrew stood beside his carriage and looked at Phoebe and Han Shu with an amiable expression as he spoke with a smile. Blushing slightly, Phoebe looked at Han Shu and said in a low voice, "Be careful on the road." She then walked over to Andrew and said coquettishly, "Of course not, he's so dumb that you don't know how infuriating it is." Han Shu didn't continue to listen to their conversation and didn't ride in the carriage that had come with Phoebe. Instead, he walked towards the north of the city alone. It was already late at night and there were almost no pedestrians on the road. Han Shu hadn't felt any danger when he just left the Buzz Merchant Guild, but when Han Shu had passed through a road and just entered an alley, he suddenly raised his guard. With a thought, 3 original demons were silently released from the back of Han Shuo's neck. As soon as the original demons left Han Shuo's neck, they immediately transformed into an incorporeal state, and concealed themselves in 3 directions without leaving a trace in the darkness. It was as if he'd suddenly gained a few more pairs of eyes. Apart from what was directly in front of him, Han Shuo could even clearly see the situation behind and to his left and right. The original demons formed from magical yuan didn't have a trace of fighting aura or magic on their bodies. In their incorporeal state, it was very difficult to detect them with the naked eye. Therefore, the departure and concealment of the original demons didn't alarm anyone at all. Behind Han Shuo was the wind adept mage Ellis that he'd seen last time. His body floated like a wisp of a ghost, silently trailing behind Han Shuo. On the rooftops of the alleys to his left and right, 4 assassins dressed in black walked silently behind him, slowly closing in on him. Shocked, Han Shuo hadn't thought that Grover would be so daring. He'd made his move right after he'd left the Merchant Guild. It looked like he really did hate Han Shuo to the bone. Han Shuo suddenly calmed down at a time like this that concerned his life and death. There were 5 people in total. Apart from the wind adept mage Ellis, the strength of the other 4 wasn't weak either. According to the observations of the original demons, Han Shuo discovered that the 4 were divided into 2 warriors, 1 mage, and 1 archer. If it wasn't for the fact that the original demons could monitor their movements at all times this time, Han Shuo would have been hard-pressed to escape death. However, now that he had the original demons, although Han Shuo didn't have the slightest advantage in terms of strength, it wasn't like he didn't have any hope of escaping alive. Because on the way here, Han Shuo had already learned from Phoebe's explanation that there was a mansion of Imperial soldiers stationed not too far ahead of the alleyway. The reason why Han Shuo had chosen to walk through this dark alleyway was also because of the mansion in front of him. His mind raced for a moment, and Han Shuo understood that these people could only make their move in this alleyway. Otherwise, once he passed through this alleyway, they wouldn't have a chance. The space ring lit up faintly and Han Shuo grasped the dagger in his right hand. Han Shuo's footsteps were neither fast nor slow as he advanced, paying attention to the movements of his enemies at all times according to the surveillance of the original demons. Finally, when Han Shuo had reached the middle of the alleyway, the 5 assassins, including Ellis, seemed to think that they were in position and suddenly sped up their approach. The faint sound of an arrow breaking through the air suddenly fell into Han Shuo's ears. This arrow was incomparably sharp and shot swiftly and violently towards Han Shuo's back as soon as it appeared. Its momentum was exceedingly fierce. This arrow had come from a professional archer, and the angle was exceedingly tricky and vicious. If it wasn't for Han Shuo observing his movements clearly through the original demons, this arrow alone would likely have killed Han Shuo on the spot. His originally unhurried footsteps suddenly sped up, but he didn't charge forward, instead retreating to the left. With a whoosh, the arrow streaked past the corner of Han Shuo's clothes and suddenly whistled forward. In front of Han Shuo, the arrow suddenly shattered into pieces. Several sharp wind blades had long since been released by Ellis, as if waiting for Han Shuo to subconsciously burrow into them. It was a pity that Han Shuo had detected them one step ahead and forcibly avoided them. At the same time, the top of his head suddenly lit up and a wall of fire abruptly formed, enveloping Han Shuo below. 2 nimble figures instantly lifted long swords and flew down from the roof. Han Shuo could see the light and dark green fighting aura clearly under the illumination of the wall of fire. Suddenly accelerating, Han Shuo's speed soared in a flash and he suddenly circled around from the left, then avoided the obstruction of Ellis' wind blades and flew towards the exit of the alleyway. Han Shuo had just left his original spot when the wall of fire came crashing down. The place where he'd been standing before was filled with sparks. No matter how they imagined it, they didn't know that Han Shuo had already clearly seen their deliberate concealment through the original demons. They'd originally thought the attack to be absolutely accidental, but Han Shuo had already seen it all. This was why the first wave of attacks from the 5 of them with extraordinary strength had all failed. "We can't let him leave this alleyway alive!" Ella's gentle voice had purposefully become sharp and suddenly rang out at this moment. The archer and the other fire mage stood on the rooftops on both sides of the alleyway. As soon as Ella's words had landed, they acted at almost the same time. 3 arrows were grabbed by the archer and placed on his longbow. With a whoosh, they shot out swiftly and violently towards Han Shuo's forehead, back, and thighs. Another wall of fire suddenly formed in front of Han Shuo, forcibly blocking off Han Shuo's path and forcing Han Shuo to take a detour. Otherwise, it would be difficult for him to escape the burning of the wall of fire. The 2 swordsmen who just landed took advantage of this moment to quickly approach with their swords raised. They were only 10 meters away from Han Shuo. Ella's feet didn't touch the ground as he also swiftly rushed over from behind, obviously intending to leave Han Shuo here. His body tilting, Han Shuo changed direction again and circled to the right, intending to go around the wall of fire and rush out of the long street. A few wind blades came whistling over. All of this was within Han Shuo's expectations. The dagger in his hand quickly waved, and 5 wind blades were chopped away by Han Shuo's dagger. However, 3 of the wind blades still slashed past Han Shuo's thigh and arm. Han Shuo had only been hit by 3 wind blades because he'd known beforehand that Ellis had set up wind blades here. Otherwise, if more than 10 wind blades had struck his vitals, he probably wouldn't have been able to take another step forward. Braving the injuries to his thigh and arm, Han Shuo rushed out of the attack of the wind blades and evaded the wall of fire and flying arrows at the same time. He dashed towards the entrance of the alleyway like lightning and had already escaped the second wave of attacks. He was about to rush out of the long street. Right at this moment, a mournful scream suddenly tore through the silent sky. Han Shuo, in the midst of running, suddenly discovered the archer with the aid of the original demons. The longbow in his hand had been broken in 2, and fresh blood was dripping from the corners of his mouth as he fell limply from the roof. Phoebe stood proudly with a long sword in her hand where he'd just been. "Fie! Phoebe, you're actually a sword master!" The hooded Ellis had forgotten to change his voice due to his excitement. He used his original voice and exclaimed in surprise. Then, without calling for the others, Ellis' rapidly charging body abruptly stopped. He abruptly turned around and fled at an even faster speed to the back. Phoebe snorted coldly and didn't chase after the fleeing Ellis. After all, if a wind mage ran with all his might, it was indeed very difficult to catch up to him. Waving the long sword in her hand, Phoebe, standing majestically on the roof, landed lightly on the 2 warriors below. It looked like she planned on taking care of the remaining people first. At this moment, Han Shuo had almost made it out of the long alley when he saw Phoebe suddenly appear. He was overjoyed and abruptly turned around, opening his mouth to summon Little Skull and walking quickly towards the 2 warriors. Han Shuo had been running with all his might earlier, so Little Skull hadn't been of much use. Now that a sword master like Phoebe was present, Han Shuo had turned from prey to hunter. It was naturally time for Little Skull to appear and kill the enemy. When Little Skull appeared with the bone dagger in hand, its calf bones started running quickly under Han Shuo's orders. The 7 bone spurs on its back flapped as it rushed towards the roof with a whoosh, attempting to take care of the other fire mage. The fire mage jumped in fright, never having thought that Little Skull would be able to use the momentum to leap onto the roof. In his panic, he immediately chanted an incantation. A wall of blazing flames appeared once again, completely blocking off Little Skull's only path. However, Little Skull didn't care about the obstruction of the wall of flames at all and charged headlong into the wall of flames. When Little Skull walked out of the wall of flames, the fire mage was already in front of him, flabbergasted. It waved the bone dagger in its hand and turned the fire mage into a beehive. Chapter 79. There were only 2 swordsmen left, one senior swordsman and the other journeyman warrior. Just Phoebe alone was enough to make it hard for the 2 of them to escape death. Han Shuo, turning around, only sped up the speed of their deaths. With a flash of his space ring, Han Shuo took out a crossbow and inserted an arrow into it. He was already facing one of the swordsmen. Just as they suddenly retreated and wanted to escape, Han Shuo's crossbow had already been fired, shooting towards the back of the senior warrior's heart. The senior swordsman who had turned around and planned to escape had no choice but to turn around and block the arrow, but by the time he'd shattered the crossbow arrow shot by Han Shuo, Phoebe was already standing in front of him. The little skull who'd killed the fire mage held a bag in his left hand and jumped down from the roof with a whoosh. The skeleton shook for a bit, and was already standing in front of another journeyman swordsman with his sword. When Han Shuo walked over with a cold smile, the two swordsmen suddenly slashed their own necks with the long swords in their hands and fell to the ground. These are the people of Shadow Ghost. If they know that there's no way out, they'll choose to end their own lives. Phoebe shook her head and put the sword in her hand back into her space ring, frowning as she spoke. At this moment, the little skull arrived in front of the two corpses and began to loot their bodies with practiced ease. When he'd hung 2 more bags in his left hand, he picked up the bone knife and walked happily towards Han Shuo, handing a total of 3 bags to Han Shuo. Smiling as he touched the little skull's skull, Han Shuo took the 3 bags and cursed out loud after taking a look. "Damn it, 3 poor bastards, and only 10 gold coins!" Rolling her eyes at Han Shuo, Phoebe didn't examine the corpses and directly said to Han Shuo, "I've never seen someone as greedy as you. There's no need to examine the corpses, you won't find anything. The people of Shadow Ghost don't bring anything important when they go out to do things, so just give up, they won't bring you any wealth." Hearing Phoebe say this, Han Shuo cursed again and chanted an incantation to send the little skull away. He then grinned and said softly, "Didn't you leave with Andrew? Why are you suddenly back? You're hurt?" Phoebe was startled and immediately walked towards Han Shuo. She revealed a worried expression when she saw that Han Shuo's body had been slashed by the wind blades. Her space ring lit up and gauze and medicine appeared in her hands. She no longer held back and said gently, "Don't move!" It was rare for Han Shuo to see this kind of expression on Phoebe's face, and he was slightly touched. He stood there dumbly without moving and watched as Phoebe carefully applied the medicinal powder on his wounds and bandaged them with gauze. When Phoebe was done, she finally tugged at Han Shuo and exhaled softly. "You've picked a good place. There are 2 large mansions around this alley, and the people from both families are gone. No one came out despite the fierce fighting here, so it looks like the houses haven't been sold yet. However, we can't stay here for long. Although the security here isn't very tight, there will still be soldiers patrolling the streets every once in a while. We should leave as soon as possible. Let's go." Han Shuo agreed and left with Phoebe, hurrying towards the northern part of the city. He asked along the way, "Right, you still haven't told me why you suddenly came back." Seeing that there was no one around, Phoebe furrowed her brow and said in a low voice, "In Grandpa Andrew's carriage, he told me that Grover has been doing business with the barbaric orcs recently. He actually sold the Empire's weapons to the orcs. This matter has too many implications, and the Empire will never let him go once they find out. If I take control of the Merchant Guild, Grover definitely won't be able to conceal this matter. Therefore, he won't wait for me to take control of the Merchant Guild and will certainly kill me before that. Otherwise, once this matter is exposed, Grover will find it difficult to escape the Empire's punishment no matter how strong he is. After I found out about this, I knew that he would definitely kill you first. I was worried about you, so I left Grandpa Andrew midway and came to find you." Nodding, Han Shuo said, "So that's how it is. No wonder that Grover wants to kill us so quickly. It looks like as long as you have this bit of evidence, Grover will die without a doubt." "That's right." Phoebe smiled coldly and thought for a moment. She sighed and said, "However, now that Ellis knows of my strength, I think Grover will definitely think of another way. The next time there's an assassination attempt, I think even I will have a hard time dealing with it." Han Shuo knew that his own strength was limited. If he couldn't even deal with Phoebe, then he likely wouldn't be of much use. The only thing that could help Phoebe was his sensitive senses for assassins. After thinking for a moment, Han Shuo said, I'll leave for a moment and come find you when my injuries have healed. Grover is our common enemy now. I know what to do. All right, but don't return to the academy no matter what. Since Grover knows of your identity, you'll face great danger if you remain in the academy for the next few days. Phoebe mused for a moment and said to Han Shaw. Nodding his head to indicate that he understood, Han Shaw told Phoebe to be careful and left by himself. The 3 original demons accompanied him from beginning to end. They didn't discover any other activity until Han Shaw arrived at the cemetery in the mountains behind the academy. After returning to the cemetery of death, Han Shaw first practiced a bit of magical yuan. Under the circulation of magical yuan, Han Shaw's wounds had a cool feeling and the pain was greatly reduced. It was already noon the next day after he slept. Now that all the ingredients had been gathered, Han Shaw impatiently left the cemetery of death and headed towards the dwarf village. He planned on having the dwarf village chief, Calvin, forge the demon's lair edge for him. The dwarf village was within a small mountain valley and there were enormous trees covering the front of the village. If it wasn't for the fact that Han Shaw had followed the dwarves here before, he really would have found it difficult to discover where they lived. Now that Han Shaw was familiar with the road, he arrived at the dwarf village in a short while. After passing through the enormous trees, a dwarf standing guard in front of him held a sharp axe in his hand. When he saw Han Shaw, he immediately called out in a friendly voice, "Oh, good friend, you've come again!" Following behind the dwarf, Han Shaw passed through a small shrubbery path and finally arrived at the dwarf village. Calvin, Bennett, and the others who had come upon hearing the news all came out to welcome Han Shaw with smiles on their faces. Fine wine was served after a while. The dwarves lived in the small wooden houses they built themselves, and some also lived in hollowed-out tree holes. There were only 100 or so dwarves in this village, and women and children made up the majority. Only 60 or so of the able-bodied men could truly fight. After spending time together, Han Shaw had already won the sincere friendship of the dwarves. They were quite generous to Han Shaw, and every time Han Shaw came over they would welcome him with fine wine and meat, making Han Shaw quite moved. "Han Shaw, how did you find the time to come over this time?" Calvin chuckled as he greeted Han Shaw. Taking out the materials that Phoebe had prepared from his space ring, Han Shaw handed them over to Calvin. "Elder, these are the materials that were prepared according to your requirements. There's enough black iron ore as well. Can you see if you can forge a weapon for me?" Calvin took the materials that Han Shaw had handed over and carefully examined them, saying with pleasant surprise, "Yes, of course I can. It's a happy thing for us to have enough materials to forge a good weapon. Don't worry, Han. We'll start work tomorrow and we'll be able to forge a weapon for you in about a week. You'll be sure to be satisfied." Han Shaw truly breathed a sigh of relief when he heard this guarantee and immediately expressed his sincere gratitude to Calvin. The low complaints of a few dwarven women traveled in from the distance. Han Shaw's ears were quite sharp and he couldn't help but pay attention to their conversation. "Ai, it's almost winter. We won't be able to secure our food in the snow, and the village chief has already taken out his stored rations to entertain the guests. I don't know how we'll get through the winter if this continues." "That's right. A few days ago, I heard that those damned ogres appeared in the vicinity again. It looks like these ogres are going to plunder again in order to get through the winter. If they discover our village, then we'll have to move again. I really don't know when these days will come to an end." Han Shaw heard every word of the dwarven women's conversation. Han Shaw was a bit moved. It looked like the lives of the dwarves weren't as easy as he'd imagined. But even so, they always brought out the best food to entertain Han Shaw whenever he came over. This made Han Shaw feel quite apologetic. After thinking for a moment, Han Shaw sighed lightly and said to Calvin, "Elder, do you not think of me as a friend?" "Han, why would you say that? Could it be that we've done something wrong?" Bennett, who had a good impression of Han Shaw, was the first to exclaim in surprise and look at Han Shaw in confusion before Calvin could open his mouth. Shaking his head, Han Shaw sighed. "Why do you worry about food and the ogres, but not tell me you're friend?" "Han, It's because we're good friends that we don't want to trouble you. In addition, because of your help, we've already obtained a lot of ore. We can forge many weapons with these ores. We won't have to be afraid of those ogre villains this year." Calvin sighed in relief when he heard Han Shuo's words and responded with a smile. "No, since the elder is willing to take out the village's winter rations for me, I have to do something as a friend. Don't worry, elder, I'll head to the human society and help you resolve your winter rations problem. Apart from these, I can help you deliver anything else you need." "How can that be? Although we're friends, we can't trouble you. We also want to purchase these items from the human society, but we'll have to pass through a long stretch of the dark forest to get there. Not only will we be attacked by magical creatures, but we may also run into adventurers with ill intentions. That's why we have to stay here. Han, I know that if you help us purchase these items, it'll cost you a lot of gold coins. We can't trouble you like this. I think if we work a bit harder, we'll be able to make it through this winter," Calvin said. "Then it's decided. I'll help you think of a way to deal with your winter rations and the threat of the ogres. You can continue to focus on forging weapons and leave the rest to me." Han Shuo did some mental calculations. The dwarven village had a population of 100 or so. According to the amount of food stored in the space ring, he'd be able to bring all the food they needed to the cemetery of death after a few teleportations. If he bought it from Phoebe, it probably wouldn't cost much either. Han Shuo was naturally willing to do this for the dwarves. "Thank you. I thank you on behalf of my children and the mothers in the village." A dwarf woman suddenly heard Han Shuo's promise when she'd come over to deliver some fruits. She was so moved that she immediately used the dwarven etiquette to express her gratitude to Han Shuo. "Hurry up and go down," Calvin admonished, and then said with equal gratitude, "Han, we only know how to brew wine and forge weapons. Because we rarely interact with humans, we don't have many gold coins. We're willing to brew wine and forge some weapons for you in exchange. Otherwise, I won't accept your good intentions." Although Han Shuo didn't covet their wine and weapons, he understood the dwarves' stubborn temperament, and knew that they wouldn't be willing to accept good intentions for no reason. He finally agreed after thinking for a bit. With Han Shuo's guarantee of winter rations, all the dwarves were seething with excitement. Even Calvin drank to his heart's content with Han Shuo, a rare occasion. One had to say, the wine that the dwarves brewed was indeed quite sweet and fragrant. Even the wine that Han Shuo had drunk in the Buzz Merchant Guild last night couldn't compare to their brews. Because the Demon's Lair edge had been secured, Han Shuo was also in a good mood and drank to his heart's content with the dwarves. However, because of his training in magical yuan, Han Shuo had completely awakened as soon as he'd left the dwarven village. He'd vigilantly returned to the cemetery of death. Before continuing to meditate, Han Shuo thought for a bit, and decided to once again explore the boundary that was preventing Han Shuo from entering the depths of the cemetery of death. He wanted to see if he could break through the boundary with his current mental strength. After using the round green ball to open up the passageway, Han Shuo focused his mental strength and abruptly burrowed in. His mind was instantly filled with bone-piercing pain, but because he was used to the pain that the round green ball brought him when training, Han Shuo forced himself to endure it. He raised his magical yuan to the maximum and charged straight in. A crisp crack sounded as Han Shuo's body tilted and broke through the invisible boundary, his body falling towards the bottom of the passageway. Chapter 80. When Han Shuo landed on the ground and steadied himself again, he took a look around and discovered that he was in an enormous laboratory. All sorts of containers and enormous bones were placed everywhere. On the walls to the side, a few ghostly green lanterns lit up the interior so that it was no longer completely dark. There were also a few rooms in the surroundings. When Han Shuo entered the rooms one by one, he discovered that 2 of the rooms were filled with all sorts of books on necromancy magic, including some on dark magic. The books here all appeared to be very ancient, and were covered with a lot of dust. The collection of books here was even more voluminous than the library of the Academy of Magic and Force. Many of the books were ones that Han Sha had never heard of before. The other 4 rooms were filled with all sorts of magical materials. All the containers were sealed and filled with colorful liquids, as well as some peculiar bones and the shining teeth of vicious magical beasts. Just as Han Sha was taking in his surroundings, the green ball in his hand suddenly blossomed with a dazzling green light. The light enveloped the entire laboratory, and a dark, ghostly shadow suddenly appeared in a circular magical symbol in the middle of the laboratory. My child, welcome. When you see this mirror image, I will have already returned to the earth. If you want to understand everything about the cemetery of death, you must pay attention to every word I say. The dark shadow was thick and thick. Whether it was the lanterns or the light of the green ball, either allowed Han Sha to see its original appearance. It spat out one word after another with some difficulty in a hoarse voice. Han Sha was shocked and immediately understood that this was a way for mages to leave behind information, mirror images. According to the meaning of the words, Han Sha quickly concentrated and started to listen to every word it said. First of all, you must know that the cemetery of death was the holy land of necromancers in our era. It symbolized the pinnacle of necromancy magic. The cemetery of death can be moved. As long as you can control everything here, in the end, you will discover that you possess a terrifying city. The faint voice continued to narrate. Han Sha focused his attention and listened to the voice's slow narration. When the voice said, "You can still see me on the next level," the dark shadow suddenly disappeared without a trace. Apart from the large-scale magical matrix on the top floor, the laboratory and library on this floor, there were 2 floors below the cemetery of death. If one wanted to completely grasp all the secrets of the cemetery of death, they had to reach the 2 floors below together. From the dark shadow's words, Han Sha understood that the cemetery of death was actually a moving castle, and a castle with boundless power. This greatly shocked Han Sha. The green ball was the key to the cemetery of death. It contained the necromancer's evil mental brand. Apart from necromancers with necromancy aura of death, ordinary people who obtained this ball would not be able to escape its corrosion and would ultimately turn into a senseless zombie. Although Han Sha was only a magic apprentice, he still had the aura of a necromancer. Fortunately, he had not been assimilated by the curse. However, because his mental strength was too weak, if it wasn't for the help of his magical yuan, he would likely have been unable to escape death if he had rashly used his mental strength to explore. The miraculous magical yuan was different from any energy in this world. It had actually helped Han Sha. When Han Sha's mental strength had invaded his brain, it had unimaginably helped him increase his mental strength. Han Sha had continuously reaped great rewards amidst the inhuman pain. This was something that even the creator of the round ball would not have imagined. The information that Han Sha had obtained from the Dark Shadow's narration was limited. It seemed that a more in-depth explanation existed on the 2 floors below. Han Sha mused silently for a moment, and once again entered the room where the magic books were stored. Magic books were the crystallization of necromancy magic, products from the peak of necromancy magic. These were priceless treasures to Han Sha. The Babylon Academy of Magic and Force already had a very large collection of books, but there weren't that many books on necromancy magic. Moreover, many of them were only books on basic and intermediate magic. There were very few books on more advanced necromancy magic. In the 2 rooms, Han Sha flipped through the magic books that were already covered in a thick layer of dust. He couldn't help but sigh with emotion. The magic books here were much higher in quality and quantity compared to those in the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. 3 of the magic books were called Necromancy Magic. They were divided into upper, middle, and lower volumes and placed in the most conspicuous places. These 3 volumes had obviously been given special treatment and were stored in a magic container. They looked as new as ever and would not be damaged even after tens of thousands of years. Just the first volume of Necromancy Magic was already very thick. After opening it, Han Sha discovered that the first volume had a detailed explanation from the origin of necromancy magic to the essence of necromancy magic. The knowledge within was very different from what was taught in the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Some of the necromancy knowledge and magic recorded in the first volume were mostly things that Han Shuo had never heard of before. Starting from the middle volume, there was a handwritten note on every page, with detailed notes on that page. However, it looked like the 3 volumes were a whole. When Han Shuo read the second volumes, even with the help of the handwritten notes, he still couldn't understand some of the knowledge within. Han Shuo could just barely understand the first half of the first volume, but unfortunately, this volume didn't have the help of the handwritten notes. This still made Han Shuo feel that it was very difficult. Perhaps the person who prepared this set of magic books thought that the visitor didn't need any notes at all to understand the first volume, and thus didn't leave behind any explanations. After thinking for a while, Han Shuo decided to start with the first volume. He planned to use this complete set of necromancy magic as a teaching material and slowly study and practice it. After making up his mind, Han Shuo took the round ball and left this level, returning to the upper level. He wasn't obstructed by the boundary, and then completely immersed himself in studying this volume of magic, forgetting to eat and sleep. For a few days, Han Shuo hugged this volume of necromancy magic, and tried to understand every word and sentence on it. From this volume of necromancy magic, Han Shuo understood that the magical knowledge he'd studied at the academy, including some of the released spells, was much more superficial than the explanations in the book. There were also many evil spells that Han Shuo hadn't been able to learn from Fanny. Corpse Resurrection was one of the most basic necromancy spells. It could directly turn the dead into zombies and start fighting according to the caster's will. As long as one's mental strength was strong enough, they could resurrect a terrifying zombie army. Canopy of Necromancy was another evil spell. As long as the Canopy of Necromancy was released, the combat strength and agility of dark creatures would be greatly increased under the cover of the Canopy of Necromancy. The enemy would be very uncomfortable under the cover of the Canopy of Necromancy, and their combat strength would be greatly reduced. There were quite a few spells like Corpse Resurrection and Canopy of Necromancy in this volume alone. It was said that these spells had been lost for a long time and that the necromancers of today had no way of grasping them. However, there were detailed records in this volume of necromancy magic. Han Shuo understood that he had picked up a priceless treasure this time. If this book of necromancy magic were to circulate, perhaps it would immediately change the current situation of necromancy mages, greatly increasing the strength of necromancy mages. The terror of necromancy mages would also reappear on the continent. After studying for almost 10 days, Han Shuo was either meditating or studying this volume of necromancy magic. Corpse Resurrection was a type of elementary spell, but it was a pity that Han Shuo couldn't practice it without a corpse. Canopy of Necromancy was already an advanced spell, and Han Shuo also couldn't practice it because his mental strength wasn't enough. However, Han Shuo did manage to grasp the spell, Bone Spear, through this period of training. He even seemed to be on the verge of mastering the spell, Summon Zombie. It was just that there was a slight obstruction when communicating with the other dimension. Calculating the time, it should be about time that the Demon's Lair edge was completed. Han Shuo thought for a bit and left the Cemetery of Death first. Together with Little Skull, they carefully avoided some level 3 and above magical beasts, hunted some low-level magical beasts, and carried them with them. They once again walked towards the dwarf village. Halfway through their journey, just as Han Shuo was about to enter the dwarf village, he heard the sound of weapons clashing. Han Shuo was shocked and suddenly increased his speed, shuttling through the bushes with Little Skull, heading straight for the source of the sound. Dozens of ogres and close to 100 goblins were holding weapons and attacking the dwarves from all sides. The dwarves had brand new weapons in their hands. Their weapons were much more advanced and sharper than those used by the ogres and goblins. In particular, the goblins were wielding simple knives, forks, and clubs, which broke into many pieces when they clashed with the dwarves' weapons. It was because of their advanced weapons that the dwarves, who were at a complete disadvantage in terms of numbers, had been able to hold out until now. Not far behind them was the dwarf village. There were women and children who had no fighting ability there. Therefore, for the safety of the village, they couldn't even retreat into the village, lest the women and children be exposed and endanger the safety of the women and children. When Han Shaw saw this scene, Han Shaw was instantly enraged. His crossbow was already in hand as he ran. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. A few crossbow bolts tore through the air as one ogre and 2 goblins were shot to death. Little Skull seemed to have sensed the anger in Han Shaw's heart. The 7-boned spurs on its back shot out in all directions as it dashed forward. Blood spurted out from the ogres' and goblins' bodies after a sharp whistle. "Oh, it's Han, he's here!" Bennett raised his iron hammer, and was surrounded by 5 or 6 goblins when he suddenly saw Han Shaw appear and cried out in surprise. Like a wolf in a flock of sheep, Han Shaw and Little Skull's arrival immediately brought about a bout of blood. Little Skull was especially valiant as its 7-boned spurs danced in the air within the group of ogres and goblins, causing large numbers of ogres and goblins to die. When Han Shaw arrived, he first summoned a few skeletal warriors. Each of them wielded bone knives as they charged at these villains. Bennett pointed at the weapon beside him with the hammer in his hand and said to Han Shaw. The demon's lair edge was 2 feet long, and its sharp edge sparkled with a faint cold light. Its entire body was dark brown, and its tip was as sharp as a tri-edged military knife. It was very heavy to hold in one's hand. Han Shaw held the demon's lair edge and examined it carefully. He then abruptly stabbed it into the whetstone below. With a poof, the entire demon's lair edge sank into the whetstone. Nodding, Han Shaw looked satisfactorily at the somewhat apprehensive Calvin and said with a slight smile, "Elder, thank you for your forging. I like this weapon very much." "Heh, as long as you like it. I'm also very satisfied with this weapon that's a mixture of black iron and black gold, as well as 10 or so rare metals." Calvin heaved a sigh of relief and looked at the demon's lair edge. "You guys keep an eye out. Perhaps the ogres and goblins will appear again in the near future. I'll leave for a while first. When I come back next time, I'll bring your winter rations. You guys be careful." After repeatedly reminding the dwarves, Han Shaw impatiently returned to the cemetery of death and activated the magical yuan in his body. He used his essence blood as a primer to flow into the demon's lair edge. According to the memories left behind by Chu Kanglin, he continued to forge the demon's lair edge for 3 days and 3 nights. During this time, Han Shaw's magical yuan mixed with his essence blood slowly flowed into the demon's lair edge. After 3 days, Han Shaw was completely exhausted and felt that his magical yuan was somewhat depleted. However, the originally dark brown demon's lair edge had turned completely dark red. For the next few days, Han Shaw waited for his magical yuan to recover before using the demon's lair edge to practice the arts of controlling magic, attempting to control the demon's lair edge with his mind. During this process, Han Shaw's meridians would often swell painfully. On this day, relying on the enormous impact of the waterfall, Han Shaw gritted his teeth and continuously used his magical yuan to refine all the meridians in his body. Suddenly, his entire person sank into a trance. Without realizing it, Han Shaw slowly woke up and discovered that he had actually fallen into a deep pool at some unknown time. When Han Shaw walked out of the icy pool, he suddenly discovered that the demon's lair edge was missing. He was shocked and hurriedly tried to find the demon's lair edge. Just at this moment, a dark red light suddenly shot out from the pool and flew straight towards Han Shaw. Han Shaw thought that it was a dangerous attack and was about to dodge when he discovered that an indescribable feeling rose up in his heart. It was as if there was a faint connection between him and the dark red light that shot towards him. Han Shaw stared blankly for a moment before a thought flashed through his mind. The abruptly awakened Han Shaw's heart moved. The dark red light that had shot towards him suddenly danced in the air according to Han Shaw's will. After that, Han Shuo sensed a swimming fish in the deep pool. A thought surfaced in his mind and the fish was instantly pierced through by the demon's lair edge. It looks like I've succeeded. Han Shuo opened his left hand and the demon's lair edge shot out from the water and landed in the center of Han Shuo's palm with a whoosh. Under the circulation of the magical yuan, the speed of the mystical glacial spell fire was much faster than usual. Han Shuo was once again shocked and suddenly discovered that threads of cold air were leaking out from the demon's lair edge in his left hand under the infusion of the mystical glacial aura. Because the demon's lair edge was facing the deep pool, a layer of ice had already formed on the surface of the pool water that was emitting cold air. After the magical yuan had circulated around his body once, Han Shuo discovered to his surprise that the speed of the magical yuan flowing through his body was many times faster than usual. This was the case for all of the meridians in his body. There was no longer any feeling of stagnation anywhere. This made Han Shuo wildly excited. This was because he knew that this was the sign of breaking through to the channel opening stage and reaching the molded spirit stage. Han Shuo was gratified to know that after experiencing several life and death battles, as well as the sleepless days of magical training, he had finally broken through again. Now that Han Shuo's demonic arts had improved again, and he'd obtained the demonic treasure, the demon's lair edge, Han Shuo felt that it was time to leave the cemetery of death and thoroughly eradicate the threat of Grover. Walking out from the cemetery in the back of the mountain, Han Shuo didn't immediately go find Phoebe. Instead, he thought of Fanny. Han Shuo admired Fanny from the bottom of his heart. After their last meeting, he had originally planned to ask her for guidance on magical knowledge. Unfortunately, because he had obtained the black gold ore from Phoebe, he couldn't wait to return to the cemetery of death. There was a lot of knowledge in the first volume of necromancy magic that even Han Shuo wasn't clear on. This volume didn't have any notes yet. As an adept mage in the necromancy major, Phoebe should have a higher level of understanding. Therefore, Han Shuo had long since noted down the questions that he didn't understand and planned on taking the opportunity to ask Phoebe again. The Babylon Academy of Magic and Force had a lofty position in the Empire. Although Grover hated Han Shuo to the bone, he didn't dare openly make a move against Han Shuo within the academy. The strength of the teachers of each major was very strong. Apart from the necromancy major, the other majors had even stronger principles holding down the fort. Chapter 81. Fanny's room was next to a few dark major female teachers, but there was still a bit of distance between them. His sensitive senses allowed Han Shuo to clearly hear the low sounds of conversation coming from the teachers' dormitories. It looked like none of them had fallen asleep yet. Every teacher of the Babylon Academy was an expert with extraordinary strength. Han Shuo purposefully concealed his presence as he approached, and even his heartbeat slowed considerably. Just as Han Shuo stood in front of Fanny's room and was about to extend a hand to knock on the door suddenly opened. Fanny was wearing a silk nightgown, revealing a patch of snow-white skin on her chest. She wore the ruby necklace that Han Shuo had given her, making her appear even more radiant and beautiful. "Brian, what are you sneaking over here for?" Fanny looked at Han Shuo with a bit of displeasure. Looking left and right, Han Shuo asked in surprise, How did you discover me?" "I've felt like I've been followed recently, so I've been on guard. I released life detection in front of the door, so I discovered you as soon as you came over." Fanny rolled her eyes at Han Shuo and said unhappily when she saw Han Shuo look around furtively, Teacher Fanny, can I go in?" It wasn't convenient to stand at the door and talk. Add to that the fact that the teachers in the surrounding rooms weren't asleep yet. It wouldn't be good if they saw them. Who would have thought that Fanny's dainty cheeks would flush slightly red when Han Shuo said this? Fanny hesitated for a moment, and also stuck her head out to look around. Only then did she drag Han Shuo in with a red face and hastily shut the door. Upon entering Fanny's room, Han Shuo discovered that the room was filled with a feminine aura. The pink bed curtains, clean and tidy tables, chairs, and carpets, as well as some elegant furnishings, all indicated that the owner of the room was female. A thought suddenly struck Han Shuo as he remembered that in his original world, young girls wouldn't easily allow unfamiliar men into their rooms. Every girl's room was the window to her soul. If one didn't receive her approval, they absolutely wouldn't be able to enter. Han Shuo's heart rippled as he looked at Fanny with a fiery gaze. "What are you looking at? Where have you been these days? There will be a test in half a month. You must come and participate, otherwise the school has the right to expel you." Fanny glared fiercely when she saw Han Shuo's fiery gaze. She then thought of something and turned her back on Han Shuo, removing the ruby necklace from her pure white neck. "I understand. I've come to find you this time because I want to ask you for some magical knowledge. Why did you take off the necklace? I feel that you look quite beautiful with this necklace on." "None of your business. It's already night time. Of course I'm going to rest after taking off the necklace." If you want to ask for magical knowledge, come find me in the lab tomorrow during the day. It's already night time. It wouldn't be good if someone discovered you were here. Fanny looked unhappily at Han Shuo. Footsteps rang out from outside the door at this moment. After a while, the footsteps had arrived in front of Fanny's door. There were 2 knocks on the door and a girl's voice sounded. "Master Fanny, you're not asleep yet. Can I come in?" Fanny and Han Shuo glanced at each other, and both of their faces froze. Fanny then glared fiercely at Han Shuo and made a shushing gesture with her hand. She raised her voice. "Master Camilla, wait a moment, I'll open the door for you right away." Fanny suddenly began to walk around the room after speaking, her eyes continuously scanning the surroundings. It looked like she wanted to help Han Shuo find a place to hide. Fanny's room wasn't too large and there didn't seem to be a place where Han Shuo's entire body could be hidden. In her anxiety, Fanny suddenly saw her bed and her face lit up with joy. She pointed at the bed to Han Shuo. Han Shuo saw that Fanny was so anxious and shrugged his shoulders. He followed Fanny's instructions and stood up from the side of the table, walking towards her bed with pink curtains. He climbed onto Fanny's bed with a whoosh, an expression of great enjoyment appearing on his face. Fanny had already walked to the door and was about to open it when she turned her head and was greatly startled. She mouthed soundlessly and pointed anxiously under the bed with her right hand. It looked like she wanted Han Shuo to hide under the bed, but who would have thought that Han Shuo would misunderstand and had already climbed onto the bed that no man had ever touched before. "Master Fanny, hurry up and open the door." Camilla stood in front of the door and saw that Fanny was at the door through the light. She opened her mouth to urge Fanny to open the door. Han Shuo was lying on his side on the bed, surrounded by the delicate fragrance of the bed. He ignored Fanny's anxious hints and smiled as he opened the curtains, covering himself with Fanny's fragrant thin blankets. Fanny ground her teeth in anger at Han Shuo's current actions, but Camilla kept urging her to open the door. Fanny had no choice but to open the door and pretend to be calm as she responded with a smile. "Master Camilla, why have you come to find me so late at night?" Camilla was an adept mage of the Dark Major. She was already middle-aged and her looks could only be considered ordinary. When she walked into Fanny's room, she walked over to the table and sat down. She opened her mouth and said, "Your necromancy major actually suppressed the light major in the last Dark Forest trial. This gave us a lot of face. Our major will also be going out to train soon. I've come to ask you for some secrets." "What secrets?" It was pure luck that our necromancy major was able to hunt those magical creatures this time. "Master Camilla, you've been in the Dark Major for many years and have led students to train many times. You should have quite a bit of experience. I think you're asking the wrong person." Fanny kept feeling uneasy when she saw Camilla in the room. She was deathly afraid that she'd discover Han Shuo. The more worried she was, the more Fanny's gaze kept wandering around the edge of the bed, paying attention to the movements on her bed at all times. She was deathly afraid that Han Shuo would make some noise and attract Camilla's attention. "Master Fanny's bed curtains are very beautiful. Where did you buy them?" Camilla suddenly stood up and walked towards Fanny's bed unexpectedly. She kept her eyes on Fanny's bed curtains and an expression of great interest appeared on her face. Her heart trembling, Fanny suddenly and quickly approached and walked towards the bed before Camilla did. She even sat down and blocked Camilla's line of sight with her body. She straightened her spine and hastily said, "I bought them from Mill Clothing Shop. If Master Camilla likes them, then go buy one as well. 1 gold coin is enough, Fanny's bed wasn't that big to begin with. Han Shuo was already tightly pressed against the wall as he lay on his side. Fanny was so anxious that she suddenly sat down on the bed and actually sat on the back of Han Shuo's left hand. Fanny explained to Camilla in the end. A soft was enough to indicate that Fanny also felt that something was amiss. So you bought them from Mill Clothing Shop. No wonder they're so beautiful. It's a pity that I'm already of age and not as beautiful as Master Fanny. If I bought a curtain like this, I'd certainly be cursed at behind my back." Fanny's full bottom sat on the back of Han Shuo's hand. Han Shuo felt the wonderful sensation and his heart was like a monkey's gallop, not knowing what to do. Han Shuo was in the middle of enjoying the wonderful sensation when he suddenly felt that the wonderful sensation on the back of his left hand was gone. Disappointment rose in Han Shuo's heart, and he looked carefully to see that Fanny's body was still in a sitting position. It was just that her waist and abdomen had lifted her beautiful bottom slightly. The place where Fanny sat just so happened to block Camilla's line of sight. If Fanny moved, then Han Shuo behind her might be exposed. Fanny clearly felt that she was sitting where she shouldn't be. She couldn't move her body and could only lift her bottom to prevent Han Shuo from taking advantage of her. Han Shuo, who was watching from behind, could see the red flush on Fanny's neck, her fragrant shoulders and beautiful back, as well as Fanny's full bottom that revealed her curves due to her tense body. All of this fell into Han Shuo's eyes. Han Shuo didn't know what Fanny and Camilla talked about after that. His burning gaze roamed greedily over Fanny's body. As a mage, Fanny maintained the difficult horse stance. Her body trembled slightly after a while. She didn't know if it was because she couldn't bear it anymore, or if she felt that Han Shuo had already withdrawn his hand from that area. Fanny's body relaxed and her bottom sank as she sat down again. A soft came from Fanny's mouth again. Han Shuo, who had flipped his hand over to face his palm, had his palm pressed down by Fanny's bottom this time. He bent his fingers slightly and scratched an extremely sensitive area of Fanny's buttocks, immediately causing Fanny to cry out unbearably. "Master Fanny, what's wrong? Your face is so red and your body is boiling hot. Are you sick? Let me take a look for you." "No, it's nothing. Master Camilla, if there's nothing else, you can leave first. I'm tired and want to rest early." Fanny raised her trembling bottom as she spoke, wanting to stand up from the edge of the bed. Han Shuo had been enjoying the beauty of Fanny's full, smooth bottom. When he saw that he'd lost the sensation, he subconsciously reached out a hand and caressed the area where Fanny had just raised a little, Fanny's bottom. Fanny, who had been about to stand up, suddenly trembled. Her body uncontrollably sat down again due to the violent stimulation. Her bottom completely swallowed up Han Shuo's messing around left hand. "What is it? What is it? Master Fanny, there's something wrong with your body," Camilla said anxiously and then flipped open the bed drapes, wanting to put down the absent-minded Fanny. She suddenly saw Han Shuo's burning gaze and let out a startled cry. This cry roused the absent-minded Fanny. Suddenly coming to her senses, Fanny hastily stood up and paid no more attention to Han Shuo. She hastily explained, "Master Camilla, he's my student and has come to ask me questions. I was afraid that you'd misunderstand, so I told him to hide. Master Fanny, you don't need to explain. This is your private matter." "Heh, no wonder you've refused the good intentions of so many young people, even ignoring Jean. So this is what's going on. Your relationship has actually developed to the stage of sleeping together. I'm quite surprised. Master Fanny, I'm sorry that I've disturbed your fun. I'll leave right now." Camilla cried out in surprise and walked straight outside after apologizing in an odd voice. Fanny's heart was extremely flustered and she continuously tugged at Camilla, seeming to want to clarify things. However, no matter how she explained, Camilla's expression remained ambiguous, and she displayed an expression of understanding. She chuckled as she walked out of Fanny's room. When Camilla left Fanny's room, Fanny stood in front of the door and anxiously circled the table. She suddenly thought of something and abruptly charged at Han Shaw, who was still lying on the bed, baring her fangs and brandishing her claws. She opened her mouth and yelled, "Damn Brian, I won't forgive you today!" Fanny had already leapt onto the bed as soon as she'd finished speaking and began punching and kicking at Han Shaw as punishment. Her little fists rained down on Han Shaw's chest. As a mage, Fanny had no way of using her fists and feet to attack and cause any harm to Han Shaw. However, when he saw the agitated Fanny's twin peaks jiggling as she waved her little fists and her long, snow-white thighs that were revealed because her dress had been lifted a bit after she'd gotten onto the bed, Han Shaw was completely intoxicated. He first reached out his hand to stop her, then Han Shaw couldn't contain his excitement and pushed Fanny down like a fever in his head. He used his strong body to completely press down on Fanny's well-rounded and perfect body, saying repeatedly, "Master Fanny, calm down, calm down." Han Shaw yelled for Fanny to calm down, but pressed Fanny beneath him. His chest felt Fanny's firm twin peaks, his chest pressed tightly against Fanny. As Fanny struggled, the friction between their bodies caused Han Shaw to gradually lose himself. Han Shaw's face was completely red, and his eyes revealed a fiery light that made Fanny feel afraid. When Fanny couldn't move and was completely pressed under Han Shaw's body, Fanny could only see Han Shaw panting heavily. His eyes were red and filled with naked desire as he stared at her, but his mouth kept saying, "Calm down, calm down." Fanny couldn't help but feel angry. He was clearly more impulsive than anyone else, but he actually told her to calm down. Her hand was getting more and more painful, and she couldn't move no matter how she struggled. Fanny watched as Han Shaw gradually approached, and her heart was filled with anxiety. She kept softly saying, "Damn it, hurry and stop, or I won't be polite." Chapter 82. With a ghastly howl, Han Shaw clutched his lower body and moved away from Fanny's body. He curled his body with a pained expression, but his mind had completely returned to normal. Fanny sat up, straightened her clothes, and got off the bed as if nothing had happened. She glanced smugly at Han Shaw and snorted lightly. "Well, now you know how strong I am? Master Fanny, there's no need to be so vicious, is there?" Han Shaw grimaced as he clutched his aching lower body. "Damn it, you still dare say that? It was fine last time in the pool, but this time you actually violated me again. This time you actually violated me again. I'm already letting you off easy by not killing you." Fanny was filled with rage when she thought of what had just happened and glared at Han Shaw with a face full of rage. Han Shaw rolled off the bed and sat down next to Fanny with a deadpan expression. He said calmly, "Let bygones be bygones. I'll recite a magic incantation for you." Fanny looked at Han Shaw's serious demeanor and knew that he was purposefully trying to cover up what had just happened. She was about to open her mouth to yell at Han Shaw when she suddenly heard Han Shaw recite an incantation. Fanny didn't pay attention at first, but her face was filled with shock when she heard the last part. Her bright eyes sparkled with an indescribable light of excitement as she focused on Han Shaw. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked, "This is necromancy magic, I can feel it, but why have I never known of such magic?" "This is the incantation for the adept magic. Canopy of necromancy. It's a necromancy magic that has been lost for many years. I obtained it by accident," Han Shaw slowly explained when he saw Fanny's wild, joyful expression. "Just what is going on? Tell me clearly. Are there any other lost necromancy magic spells? Tell me quickly." Fanny, who had been immersed in necromancy magic, had long since forgotten her previous anger when she heard Han Shuo recite the long-lost ancient incantation from his mouth. She hurriedly asked Han Shuo about it. Heaving a sigh of relief in his heart, Han Shuo thought calmly for a moment before nodding. "There's also an evil corpse resurrection spell that I stumbled upon. Master Fanny, you should understand that this is the lost magic of our necromancy major, so I need you to keep it a secret for now." Fanny was not stupid. When Han Shuo said this, Fanny immediately understood what he meant. She nodded her head like a chick pecking at rice, and kept urging Han Shuo with her eyes. Han Shuo then carefully described the incantations and gestures for corpse resurrection and canopy of necromancy to Fanny. He then took out some of the unsolved knowledge and started asking Fanny one by one. Fanny was overjoyed and had long since forgotten Han Shuo's rudeness towards her. She patiently explained the doubts that Han Shuo had encountered in detail. Han Shuo understood that he would be able to use these necromancy magic spells sooner or later. However, before his strength was sufficient, Han Shuo didn't plan on letting others know that he had obtained these secrets. Fanny was an adept mage of the necromancy major and the target of Han Shuo's admiration. Add to that the fact that Han Shuo knew that Fanny was a hard-mouthed but kind person, and was very concerned about him. He didn't plan on keeping it a secret. After all, there was some magical knowledge that Han Shuo had to ask Fanny in order to comprehend. Unknowingly, Han Shuo stayed in Fanny's room and chatted until late at night. Fanny, who was previously excited, started to yawn continuously. When she discovered that it was already late at night, Fanny reached out to cover her mouth and yawned. She said lazily to Han Shuo, "It's getting late, I'm going to rest. I've explained all these questions to you, you should go back to the dorms and rest." "Oh, that's right, you haven't stayed in the dorms that I've arranged for you, have you?" Nodding, Han Shuo got up and walked towards the door. Just as Han Shuo was about to push open the door and leave, Fanny suddenly opened her mouth and said, "Brian, don't think that I've forgotten the bad things that you've done to me. However, if you can study hard and graduate from the necromancy major a bit faster, maybe I'll forgive you." Han Shuo was stunned and stopped at the door. He turned around to see Fanny looking at him with anticipation. Fanny's expression was solemn as she said seriously, "Brian, with your talent, this isn't a difficult matter. As long as you're willing to work hard, you'll definitely become a very powerful necromancer and obtain everything that you want. Does that include Master Fanny?" Han Shuo subconsciously opened his mouth to ask. Fanny's heart suddenly trembled as she looked at Han Shuo looking at her with a dazed expression. Her cheeks suddenly flushed red and she flew into a rage out of humiliation. She yelled out, "Get out! Hurry up and scram, you lecherous bad boy!" His heart filled with joy, Han Shuo felt that Fanny seemed to be a bit interested in him. From their recent conversations, Han Shuo felt that Fanny had high hopes for him. After careful consideration, Han Shuo suddenly realized that it wasn't realistic for him to obtain Fanny's affection with his current strength and status. "Don't worry, I'll work hard. You'll see very soon." Pausing in front of the door, Han Shuo spoke in a low voice and left in the darkness. After leaving Fanny's room, Han Shuo didn't return to the dormitory that Fanny had arranged for him. This was because there were people watching the door to the dormitory, and the rooms inside were close to each other. Han Shuo didn't want to be discovered by others in order to avoid attracting the attention of Shadow Ghost and Grover. Especially when Han Shuo had heard Fanny mention that she felt as if someone was following her. This made Han Shuo even more vigilant, and he didn't dare easily expose himself in front of others. He thought to himself that it looked like he should buy a residence outside of the school, or else he wouldn't even have a place to stay when he returned to the Empire. If he had his own private residence, then he wouldn't have to go to the cemetery behind the academy to activate the magical matrix every time. Just as Han Shuo was silently thinking and walking to the side of the dark major library, he suddenly heard the sound of pages flipping. This made Han Shuo's heart abruptly jump, and he immediately and soundlessly hid himself in the shadows of a corner around the library. With a slight movement of his neck, the three original demons flew out soundlessly and snuck into the library in the middle of the night. Two figures held a weak light in their hands, and Han Shaw saw two familiar faces under the dim light: Old Mage Duke and Senior Swordsman Eric. Han Shaw had obtained the green ball to open the Cemetery of Death from these two when he had been in the cemetery behind the Necromancy Major. The confident Eric had thought that Han Shaw would die without a doubt if he struck out with a sword filled with fighting aura, which was why he hadn't examined Han Shaw's body. Han Shaw hadn't thought that he would be able to see these two again after a few months in the Dark Major's library. Be careful, there are many strong characters in this Babylon Academy of Magic and Force. Don't alarm others, or we'll be in big trouble. Duke saw that Eric's movements were too large and immediately admonished him softly. I still haven't discovered anything. There aren't any records of the Eye of Darkness in some of the Necromancy Major's books. Eric's movements were a bit more gentle as he complained lowly. The Eye of Darkness is the key to opening the Cemetery of Death. We spent a lot of effort to obtain it, but didn't think that it would suddenly disappear without a trace. When Dylan died last time, the item wasn't on his body anymore. We went back and searched his place but didn't find anything. It's very strange why the item would suddenly disappear. The Babylon Academy of Magic and Force has many books in the Necromancy Major. Perhaps we'll be able to find some clues. Otherwise, we won't be able to bear the consequences if the higher-ups blame us. Duke glared hatefully at Eric and said lowly. Han Shaw, who was outside, had clearly observed the conversation and expressions of the two with the help of the original demon's spying. He finally understood that the ball he controlled was called the Eye of Darkness. It looked like the two had the same intentions as him when they explored the Dark Major's library at night and wanted to search for the secrets of the Eye of Darkness. In the library, the two came up empty-handed after a while and left the library dejectedly. They followed the small path that led to the back of the Babylon Academy and quickly left. From their conversation, Han Shaw knew that these two seemed to be from a certain organization. Now that he had obtained the Eye of Darkness, Han Shaw wanted to know more secrets from these two and see if they would be a threat to him. With the help of the three original demons, Han Shaw followed the two from afar and slowly snuck along with them towards the back of the mountain. The two didn't pass through the direction of the cemetery in the back of the mountain. They started to change directions as soon as they left the boundaries of the Babylon Academy of Magic and Force and quickly walked towards the northern streets. The two only walked in when they arrived at a remote courtyard in the northern district. The three original demons followed them all the way here. Just as the original demons were about to follow Han Shaw's intentions and burrow in to see what was going on, Han Shaw suddenly felt the original demons bump into something. Suddenly he felt as if Yuan Mo had bumped into something. Then a voice came from the courtyard. Who is it? Han Shaw was startled and suddenly understood that there must have been some sort of boundary set up around the courtyard. Otherwise, with the original demon's formless state, they wouldn't have been discovered at all. Just as Han Shaw was surprised, the original demons seemed to sense danger and suddenly retreated quickly. Han Shaw, who was far away, hastily used his mind to control the original demons and fled in 3 different directions on the northern street as fast as he could. After a while, the 3 original demons returned to Han Shaw's body from 3 different directions. Only then did Han Shaw heave a sigh of relief. He remembered the courtyard clearly and knew that a strong character was stationed there. He temporarily gave up on continuing to observe. He was just about to leave when he discovered that this was a street in the northern district. This courtyard wasn't too far from Phoebe's residence. At this time, the sky was already beginning to brighten. Han Shaw remembered that he had promised the dwarves food and spent a few silver coins to eat breakfast on the way. He then walked towards Phoebe's residence. When Han Shaw arrived in front of Phoebe's residence, he immediately discovered that Phoebe's residence was now much more heavily guarded. Extremely faint breathing sounds could be heard from behind the door. It looked like there were experts lying in ambush inside. In addition, there was another place in the courtyard where Han Shaw couldn't feel any circulation of air. This made Han Sho understand that some sort of boundary must have been set up. When he arrived in front of Phoebe's door, Han Sho knocked lightly. Someone immediately arrived quickly when the knocking sounded. The person didn't immediately open the door, but asked softly from behind the door. "Who is it?" "I'm Brian." "I've come to find Miss Phoebe." Han Shaw stood in front of the door and said softly, "Please wait a moment." The person inside responded as another set of footsteps quickly left. 2 sets of footsteps could be heard after a short while. "Is that Brian?" Fabian's voice sounded from the other side of the door. "It's me," Han Shaw responded. Breathing a sigh of relief, Fabian instructed, "Open the door, it is indeed Brian." The door opened and 2 swordsmen wearing silver armor stood on either side of Fabian. The lines on their faces were rough, with traces of being exposed to the elements for many years. They looked like 2 skilled fighters. "Hurry and come in, I haven't seen you for another 10 days. Phoebe always mentions you in front of me. She says that with you by her side, with your extraordinary reflexes, we can save a lot of trouble." Although a smile hung on Fabian's face, he still appeared a bit exhausted. "It looks like you haven't been doing too well lately. The last time I was here, the security wasn't as tight as it is now." Han Shaw swept his gaze over Fabian and opened his mouth to tease him. Sighing lightly, Fabian said, "Don't mention it. Miss Phoebe has already been assassinated 3 times in the 10 days since we returned from the banquet. Each time is more dangerous than the last. These people are from the Battlefire mercenary band, and Miss Phoebe spent a great deal of money to invite them over. However, 3 of them have been injured and 2 have died in the past few days. It looks like Grover is starting to get anxious. It's just that we're in more and more danger now." Han Shaw felt 2 mages and 1 warrior in the surrounding corners as he walked towards the hall where the speaker was speaking. Their strength seemed to be quite impressive. With so many experts protecting them and Phoebe's strength as a sword master, it looked like Grover and Shadow Ghost were indeed quite frightening with so many casualties. The 3 original demons once again soundlessly flew out from the back of Han Shaw's neck and avoided the boundaries set up by the Battlefire mercenary band. They concealed themselves in 3 different directions on the roof and silently observed everything around them. After a while, Phoebe walked in with a tall, beautiful woman with fiery red hair and a ponytail. This woman had bronze skin and a tall, muscular, and beautiful figure. She had a large chest, butt, and body, and a broadsword on her back. She looked like a swordsman. "Brian, I finally see you again. How wonderful!" Phoebe looked at Han Sho with pleasant surprise. "Phoebe, this is the amazing Brian that you've been talking about." The muscular woman with fiery red hair looked at Han Sho with a face full of suspicion as she spoke. "Yes, Candace. Let me see if he's as amazing as you say." Candace snorted lightly and drew the broadsword on her back, slashing fiercely at Han Sho. When the broadsword was drawn, red flames spread to the entire broadsword like a fire dragon. It looked like she was a magical swordsman. Chapter 83. Han Shun never would have thought that this girl would make a move as soon as she said so. She didn't even give him a chance to say another word. Before the broadsword neared his body, the scorching temperature was already making his skin feel a bit uncomfortable. Snorting coldly, the demon's layer edge suddenly appeared in Han Shu's left hand. Han Shu imbued it with magical yuan and activated it using the mystical glacial spell fire method. The dark red demon's layer edge suddenly emitted a faint purple cold air, and the temperature in the room suddenly changed. Candace's side was scorching hot, while Han Shu's side was eerily cold. The 2 swords in their hands hadn't yet met when the hot and cold auras had already met. Wisps of white smoke rippled out. However, what astonished Phoebe was that Han Shu's purple cold air was different from any ice magic she'd seen before. It was like a living creature, and could even bend as it advanced. When Han Shaw's and Candace's swords collided, a ferocious force mixed with fighting aura crashed onto Han Shaw's demon's lair edge like a hammer. Han Shaw's body staggered back a few steps, but when his fighting aura surged into the demon's lair edge, he found it difficult to move an inch. He had no way of breaking through the demon's lair edge's obstruction and harming Han Shaw. Candace, on the other hand, suddenly cried out loudly. When the white smoke dissipated, Han Shaw looked at Candace again and discovered that the broadsword in her hand had a chip on it. It looked like it had been cut by the demon's lair edge. Candace should have the strength of a senior swordsman, and because she also possessed fire magic, her strength was even more unfathomable. The broadsword in her hand should be an exceedingly high-quality magic sword, and had the effect of amplifying the fusion of fire magic. Who would have thought that such a good sword would be damaged by Han Shu in an instant? Just as Candace looked at the broadsword in her hand with a face full of shock and anger, seemingly planning on continuing to attack Han Shu, Phoebe, who was standing to the side, suddenly spoke up. "All right, Candace, Brian's forte isn't brute force. I've already said that his miraculous abilities come from his extraordinary senses. He destroyed my magic sword." Candace glared at Han Shu before complaining to Phoebe. "Serves you right. You asked for it. If you don't change your reckless temper, you'll suffer a lot in the future." Phoebe flicked a helpless glance at Candace and advised with good intentions. Her beautiful eyes swept over Han Shu and focused on the demon's lair edge in Han Shu's hands. Phoebe revealed an extremely interested expression and exclaimed, "Is this the weapon you want to forge? Can I take a look?" "There's nothing to look at, it's just a bit sharper than ordinary weapons." Han Shu put away the demon's lair edge without batting an eyelid and smiled at Phoebe. "Humph, petty!" Phoebe exclaimed softly and then pointed at Candace, introducing her to Han Shu. "This is the vice chief of the Battlefire Mercenary Band, Candace. She's a friend I knew in the past. Her temper is a bit brash, but she's actually a good person. Don't mind her." Nodding, Han Shu flicked a glance at Candace and said with a smile, "I don't mind, I just hope she doesn't hate me. Heh heh. It's just a magic sword, not to mention that it hasn't been completely damaged. I won't be so petty. Phoebe, you guys discuss your private matters. I'll guard the door for you outside. I hope that damned Grover knows his place." Candace glared disdainfully at Han Shu and then looked at the broadsword in her hands with a face full of heartache, walking outside with large strides. As he watched Candace walk out of the room, Han Shu felt that although this girl's temper was a bit brash, she wasn't a petty or hateful person. Otherwise, she wouldn't have left so easily. "I've come this time to buy some rations from you, and also to ask you to help me find a secluded place to live. It doesn't have to be a large place, as long as it's guaranteed that no one will discover it." Han Shu didn't mince his words as he looked at Phoebe and went straight to the point. "No problem, how much food do you need?" Phoebe was quite straightforward and didn't put it off at all. She first agreed and then asked about the amount of food. "About 100 people, enough to support a winter's worth of rations," Han Shu responded. When these words were spoken, Phoebe looked at Han Shu with an odd expression. When Han Shu felt uneasy all over, Phoebe finally said in confusion, "What do you want to do?" "A winter's worth of rations for 100 people. Are you planning on leaving the Empire?" Shaking his head with a rueful smile, Han Shu knew that she would be suspicious. He said, "Don't think too much, I'm helping a friend resolve some difficult problems. I won't be leaving the Empire in the short term if I don't eliminate Grover. There's no problem with the rations, but you'll have to give me a few days to prepare. Also, a secluded place to live. I'd advise you not to live alone outside for the time being because Grover and the people from Shadow Ghost have always viewed you as a thorn in their side. If I help you find a place to live, perhaps Grover will find some clues. If you don't mind, you can live here temporarily. That way, we can look out for each other. When Grover's threat has been eliminated, this house can be left to you and we can return to the Buzz Merchant Guild. What do you think?" Phoebe thought for a moment and looked directly at Han Shu. Hearing Phoebe's words, Han Sho thought carefully and felt that there was some truth to her words. However, Han Sho was a bit hesitant to take this residence. After all, even if the threat of Grover was eliminated, Shadow Ghost was still an enormous assassin organization. They would always be a threat if they knew where he was hiding. I know what you're worried about. Don't worry, as long as Grover is eliminated, I have a way to make sure Shadow Ghost doesn't make trouble for us again. I've officially taken charge of the Merchant Guild recently, and am currently collecting evidence of Grover's crimes. Grandpa Andrew is also fully supporting me. Uncle Andrew has even found traces of Old Thing Grover's mistress, and has sent people to seize it now. I think Grover is probably even more afraid than we are right now. Phoebe saw Han Sho furrow his brow, and couldn't help but speak comfortingly. Nodding, Han Sho said, "All right then, I'll live here for now. I'll leave after Grover is eliminated." "That's great. With you here, those damned assassins won't be able to ambush us at all," Phoebe said joyfully when she saw that Han Sho had agreed. Phoebe then had Fabian arrange a room for Han Sho. Han Sho's room was quite spacious and had all the usual amenities. He was only separated from Phoebe's room by a wall. When night fell, Han Sho sat cross-legged on the bed in the room and began to concentrate, continuing to train his magical yuan as usual. Han Sho's current magical realm had reached the molded spirit stage. This stage was mainly a process of developing the potential of the brain. As long as he could make it through this stage, Han Sho's entire being, whether it was memory, comprehension, or observation skills, would receive a large increase. His brain would be much more intelligent than the average person. However, it was precisely because this stage was a type of development of the brain's potential that it was especially dangerous. One careless mistake could cause one to sink into a stage where the mind would be completely muddled and act based on instinct. In serious cases, even if one recovered, they could still suffer from amnesia or split personality disorder. Han Sho, who was sitting cross-legged on the edge of the bed, saw that his head was enveloped in a patch of dark light. It was as if a ball of black lightning had wrapped around Han Sho's head, continuously releasing astonishing lightning from within. Han Sho continued in this state for an unknown amount of time. He let out a light breath and also stopped practicing with a bit of trepidation. After knowing the horrors of the molded spirit stage, Han Sho himself was also very careful. Every time he trained, he chose to do it in a very quiet environment, not daring to let anything disturb him. After stopping his magical yuan, Han Sho saw that his mental state was still fine and couldn't help but carefully meditate again, wanting to continue meditating to increase his mental strength. Suddenly, his mind rumbled, and the speed at which his mental strength gathered in accordance with Han Sho's will was many times faster than usual. Han Sho could very clearly feel the presence of the undead that existed everywhere between heaven and earth. Through the use of his mental strength, Han Sho could even gather the presence of the undead bit by bit, and could also feel the method in which the presence of the undead was gathered. This was something that could not be achieved when casting magic normally. This time's meditation seemed to have allowed Han Sho to suddenly enter a wondrous state. Han Sho could clearly feel the growth of his mental strength, and it was much faster than usual. Although the benefits were not as great as when he used the Eye of Darkness to train, the mental strength obtained from this kind of meditation was very clear and natural, and there was no pain at all. When Han Sho awoke from his meditation, he suddenly remembered that the first two levels of magical yuan training focused on the training of the body, meridians, and bones, but this level of molded spirit was completely for the training of the brain's potential. The meditation of mages completely relied on the brain to gather mental strength, and would never train other parts of the body. From the looks of it, if the potential of Han Sho's brain was greatly increased, then the speed at which his brain gathered mental strength through meditation would naturally increase as well. This would definitely have immeasurable benefits for Han Sho's future training in magic. As expected, the training of the same evil method in two different worlds can indeed complement each other. It looks like even without the Eye of Darkness, In the future, the mental strength I obtain from meditation will still be much faster than that of ordinary mages. Han Shuo was delighted as he murmured to himself. Phoebe, have you fallen for this stinking brat? Just at this moment, faint voices of conversation drifted over from next door. The soundproofing of this house was not bad, and if it were anyone else, they would definitely not be able to hear the conversation in the other room. But Han Shuo was naturally no ordinary person. His ears were perversely sensitive, and he clearly heard the whispers of the two girls in the dead of the night. Candace, what nonsense are you saying? Brian has helped me many times, we're just friends who have fought side by side. Phoebe's voice was extremely low as she defended herself. No way, if you're just friends who have fought side by side, why do you always protect him and give him such high praise? I keep feeling that you treat him a bit differently. Has something happened between the two of you? With my intuition as an experienced mercenary, your feelings for him are definitely different from others. Candace's voice was filled with thick distrust as she spoke in a very professional manner. There really hasn't been anything. We've been good friends for so many years, would I lie to you? Oh, right, what do you think of Brian? What do you mean? Every aspect? 2 words, odd. Chapter 84. What are you doing? Candace's face turned pale with fright as she suddenly stood up. On the other side, Phoebe seemed to have been about to undress and get ready for bed. She also jumped in fright when she saw Han Shuo rush over and hastily pulled up her clothes, looking at Han Shuo with a face full of panic. Grover's men and Shadow Ghost's men have arrived together. Don't waste words and think of a way to deal with them. Han Shuo's face was dark as he growled lowly at the 2 frantic women. Candace still had some doubts when these words left her mouth and was about to express her confusion when Phoebe's face turned grave as she yelled, Candace, listen to him. Brian wouldn't make a mistake. Candace didn't believe Han Shuo, but she did believe Phoebe. When she heard Phoebe's words, she immediately drew the broadsword from her back and nodded at Phoebe. Like a ball of fire, she suddenly rushed out. Candace's low voice of warning immediately sounded from outside the room. Phoebe didn't waste words either as she casually grabbed a robe from the side of the bed and put it on. Her space ring suddenly flashed, and a long sword flashing with cold light appeared in Phoebe's hand. Nodding at Phoebe, Han Shuo quickly made his way outside the room and saw Candace standing outside, giving instructions in a low voice. Relying on the vision of the original demons, Han Shuo closed his eyes and suddenly opened his mouth. 3 people are approaching 100 meters to the left. 2 warriors and a mage. The mage is the wind adept mage Ellis. There's an archmage leading 4 warriors and an archer in front of them. They're 130 meters away from here and are moving stealthily from the rooftops. They should be Shadow Ghost's men. There's a few people hiding in an alley 50 meters to the right, and they seem to be setting up a trap. Han Shuo closed his eyes and continuously described the positions of the swiftly approaching people in detail, as if he was personally in the midst of the battle. Candace didn't quite believe it at first. She wouldn't believe it even if she were beaten to death that he could so clearly detect human movements from so far away. However, as soon as Phoebe walked out of the room, she immediately followed Han Shuo's description and asked Candace to arrange for people to defend. Miss Phoebe, I hope you are prepared to retreat this time. Based on my estimation, I think that even with you as a swordsman, we might not be their match. If the situation is not good, I hope you will not stay here. But no matter how dangerous it is, don't retreat to the right, that's a dead end. Han Shuo suddenly opened his eyes and stared at Phoebe as he spoke solemnly. Thank you, Brian. I know what to do. You have to be careful too. Phoebe trusted Han Shuo quite a bit. When she saw Han Shuo warn her so solemnly, she immediately understood that this time would be extremely dangerous. She immediately nodded solemnly to express her understanding. Taking a deep breath, Han Shuo took out the demon's lair edge and held it in his hand. He inspected the dagger hidden on his body, and the steel needle in his leg. He then held the crossbow in his left hand and leapt onto a large tree nearby. The shadows of the house perfectly concealed Han Shuo's body. Han Shuo stared at the left side with a solemn and calm expression, not moving an inch. They're here indeed. Everyone, spread out carefully. As a swordsman, Phoebe finally heard the footsteps and rejoiced at her trust in Han Shuo. She cast a meaningful glance at Candace beside her. It was only now that Candace looked in shock at Han Shuo, who was hidden in the darkness. She never would have thought that Han Shuo would be so amazing. Not only could he detect people's movements from a distance of 100 meters, but it was as if he had a pair of eyes in the sky and could clearly detect the enemy's movements. Candace was a seasoned mercenary after all. After a brief moment of shock, she glanced at Phoebe and the two leapt up at the same time, hiding on either side of Han Shuo and also hiding in the shadows. Boo! Brian, can you slowly inform me of the enemy's movements so that I can tell the people below to be careful? Candace was a meter away from Han Shuo and said softly. Maintaining this posture, even his expression didn't change. Han Shuo's voice was low as he faintly described the enemy's movements in detail. Candace held a magical tool in her hand and used it to give instructions to the mercenaries lying in ambush in other directions in the yard. The three people on Grover's side, led by Ellis, were the first to arrive. They stopped on a rooftop to the side. Han Shuo and the others didn't make a move until the archmage hovering in the air appeared in front of the front door with a few shadow ghost experts. Only then did they hold their breaths and prepare to act at a moment's notice. The archmage didn't see how he moved. All that could be seen was that he, completely shrouded in a black robe, used an almost inaudible voice to chant a few incantations. Strong magical pulses suddenly emanated from the surroundings of Phoebe's residence, and then all the rooms began to shake violently as if a great earthquake had occurred. At the same time, the four warriors behind him quickly spread out. An archer retreated to the roof of a nearby building and surveyed the surroundings from above. Ellis saw the earth shake violently like a giant beast awakening and nodded to the two warriors in front of him. The two of them leapt down and landed in the yard below. Whoosh 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 whoosh. 5 arrows suddenly revealed themselves in the darkness. They were like 5 ruthless poisonous snakes lurking in the depths of a deep pond, quickly biting towards the two warriors who had just landed. The two had been hiding their tracks all along, but hadn't expected to be attacked so fiercely as soon as they landed. Their hearts jumped in fright, and they hastily swung their swords to defend themselves. 3 of the arrows were cut in half and 1 was dodged by the 2. Only the arrow shot by Phoebe nailed into the calf of one of the warriors. When the 2 had landed, they'd already triggered the boundary that had been set up there. 3 bolts of lightning suddenly appeared in the sky. Under the illumination of the lightning, Han Shuo could clearly see that there were iron wires as thin as hair. These iron wires were entangled with each other, and when the 2 landed, their ankles just happened to be entangled by these iron wires. With the help of the iron wire, the electricity spread out in an instant, forming a bright and beautiful silver net of electricity in that area. The 2 of them spasmed, their mouths letting out mournful howls of pain. The uninjured person was shocked by the electricity and nimbly swung his sword to cut through the iron wires. The other warrior, who had been shot in the calf, foamed at the mouth, and his hair was charred as he slowly fell into the electric net. "Not good, there's an ambush!" Ellis, who'd been planning to follow them down, suddenly shouted loudly when he saw the 2 warriors fall, warning the assassins of Shadow Ghost, who were attacking from the front. Crack, crack! The front door split apart, and 4 black-clad warriors rushed in with swords in hand. They patrolled the courtyard in 2 directions. The archmage floated into the courtyard, the staff in his left hand wrapped in a long black sleeve. As he waved it, the surrounding rooms collapsed one after another with a violent earthquake. 2 of the Battlefire mercenary band members who'd been hiding in the surrounding rooms were directly crushed to death by the collapsing houses. The other 3 had no choice but to rush out as well, all of them holding weapons in the courtyard. However, Hanshaw took a look and discovered that there was only a senior swordsman, a lightning journeyman mage, and an archer left. The archmage waved the staff in his hand and an enormous magical pulse appeared once again. 3 earth dragons that looked like icicles suddenly broke out of the ground and stabbed towards the 3 Battlefire mercenary band members that had appeared. The senior swordsman and journeyman mage dodged in time and nimbly dodged to the side before disaster befell them. The archer had raised his bow and focused his attention on the archmage, but didn't have the time to fire before the earth dragon suddenly rose from the soles of his feet and rammed into his chest. The enormous force caused him to die on the spot. Hanshaw, who was calmly controlling his breathing, could clearly feel Phoebe and Candace's breathing grow heavier at the same time. It looked like because of this person's death, the composure they'd been maintaining had completely vanished. Phoebe and Candace shot their crossbow bolts at the same time, flying towards the Earth Archmage who'd released the Earth Dragons. The two's crossbow bolts had a powerful momentum, but the Archmage waved his left hand and a wall suddenly rose from the ground. The two's crossbow bolts hit the wall and didn't cause any damage to the killer. In the shadow of the tree! Ellis didn't hide his voice again and suddenly spoke in his original voice. The whistling of wind blades sounded along with his voice. Phoebe and Candace immediately jumped out from Hanshaw's side when they heard the sound of the wind blades. Phoebe wielded a longsword that shone with dazzling light as she charged towards the Archmage with the fastest speed possible. Candace's broadsword rose into the sky with tongues of flame, making Candace look like a fire elf in the darkness, as she quickly closed in on Ellis. Hanshaw held his crossbow and didn't move as he hid in the shadow of the tree. He didn't even make a move to block the oncoming wind blades. A few wind blades sliced through tree branches, and 2 of them landed on Hanshaw's waist. However, Hanshaw grit his teeth and held on. He didn't move at all, and even his breathing and heartbeat were maintained at an astonishingly steady level. Phoebe and Candace's flight from the tree had thoroughly ignited the flames of battle. Because the Earth Archmage had caused the entire house to collapse with a large earthquake, many of the traps set up by the Battlefire mercenary band had been rendered ineffective. Phoebe knew very well how frightening an Archmage was, so she set her sights on the Archmage and immediately attacked with all her might. When Phoebe moved, 2 of the senior swordsmen from Shadow Ghost immediately joined up with the Archmage. They faced Phoebe with a combination of 2 fighters and 1 mage. In the distance, an archer from Shadow Ghost, along with 2 other swordsmen and Ellis, started attacking the people from the Battlefire mercenary band. Candace, wielding her broadsword, created a tongue of flame with every swing. The broadsword blossomed with an eye-catching light in the dark night, forcing the wind mage Ellis to continuously retreat. Ellis, borrowing the power of the wind, was nimble. As he rapidly retreated, he sent tornadoes of wind blades towards Candace. When a journeyman swordsman from Shadow Ghost arrived in front of Ellis and joined forces with him to deal with Candace, the originally awe-inspiring Candace suddenly seemed a bit strained. At this moment, whether it was Phoebe's side, Ellis, or the people from Shadow Ghost, they were all exposed in the damaged yard. Hanshaw was the only one present, still hidden in the darkness. He endured the 2 wind blades and waited for the most opportune moment to attack. Similarly at a disadvantage, Phoebe and Candace saw that Hanshaw had yet to make an appearance, and couldn't help but feel a bit of anticipation in their dejected hearts. The 2 girls were both intelligent, and had already guessed what Hanshaw was planning by hiding there at the risk of being injured. They both understood tacitly and led their opponents towards the direction of the large tree. After a while, Phoebe and Candace, who were struggling to fight their enemies, gathered under the tree where Hanshaw was hiding. They were blocked off by the Archmage, Ellis, and the others. "Beautiful Miss Phoebe, after a few battles, I greatly admire your strength. But this time, you won't have any more chances." "I'm very sorry," Ellis laughed softly. As soon as he finished speaking, the wind howled in the air in front of him, forming a violent tornado. The broken trees and rocks in the surroundings were all blown into the air by the tornado, and swept towards Phoebe and Candace. The Archmage didn't make a sound and raised his left hand. 4 tall earthen walls rose from the ground, completely trapping Phoebe and Candace like a cage. The long sword in Phoebe's hand rippled with a ball of piercing milky white light. The light formed the shape of a cross and blasted through a wall of earth, leaping out together with Candace. At this moment, the swordsmen who had been waiting on the side immediately made their moves to deal with Phoebe and Candace. Ellis had a sinister smile on his face as he gathered his mental strength and slowly manipulated the tornado to engulf the two. At this moment, a crossbow bolt pierced through the air and suddenly shot towards the Earth Archmage, who was completely shrouded in a black robe. The Archmage leaned to the side and a swordsman next to him blocked the bolt with a wave of his hand. At this moment, a bone spear appeared out of thin air and also shot towards the Archmage with a sharp whistle. The Archmage seemed to be a bit impatient as he opened his left hand slightly, and earth element magic gathered. A stone slab flew out of the ground and smashed the bone spear flying towards him. The Archmage had just breathed a sigh of relief and was about to search for the enemy hiding in the shadows when a ghastly howl suddenly sounded. Ellis clutched his chest not far away and raised his head to look at the large tree above his head in terror. A sharp weapon drilled out like a poisonous dragon and whistled out of his chest. Pfft! An arrow of blood uncontrollably spurted out from the bloody hole in Ellis' chest. Ellis' head faced the sky as his knees suddenly gave way and he knelt on the ground. He then paused and his body fell backwards. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.